In the ruined city, the remains of buildings and containers were visible under a bleak sunset sky. The sign led to 50th Street. Amidst the rubble and debris, a group of teenagers were running. They were clearly in a hurry, carrying their backpacks through the ruins of the devastated sector. The two guys stopped and started rummaging through the junk. They looked startled to find some parts and old electronics among the trash. Suddenly, a huge stone figure appeared in front of them. One of the boys recognized it. It was a golem, and it was already very close. One brave man stepped forward, holding out an old flashlight to the golem. He loudly demanded food from the stone giant in exchange for the item. The locals knew about this golem from Sector 50. No one knew where it came from or who its master was. It was just there. The most important thing was that this mysterious golem gave food. In return, it took various trash, junk, and scrap metal that no one needed. But the golem ignored the flashlight and simply walked away. The boy shouted after him, wondering why he was leaving because he had taken the same one yesterday. There was someone in a hoodie watching from above. The guy below was angry as to why the golem wasn't taking his item. The other advised him to calm down because aggression would provoke a response. The hooded figure, a guy with white hair, sat silent. He had heard talk of some golems attacking people right on the streets. Suddenly, that white-haired guy jumped down from a height. He landed right in front of the huge stone golem ready for action. He calmly held out his bag to the golem. Holding it out to the golem. The golem's huge stone hand reached down and began to take the contents of the bag. He accepted the trash offered to him without hesitation. The golem picked up the loot, his red eyes glittering. He scrutinized the items he had received while the hooded boy stood before him. The other guys looked on in amazement. They whispered, recognizing this guy again, and couldn't believe how much he got again. Food sprinkled into the boy's bag from above. Canned food, bread, a bottle of water. He calmly accepted the golem's generous reward. The boys couldn't contain their indignation. One shouted that it didn't make sense, not understanding how this lucky guy managed to get so much food every time. The white-haired boy walked away with his loot. And he thought he had an idea. Someone recognized him, calling him the ghost of 17th Street. People whispered, not believing their eyes that they could see him here, at the entrance to Sector 50 Street. The hooded guy known as Ghost turned around. He noticed he was being watched and quietly counted 7 people behind him. The white-haired guy, Ghost, turned around tiredly. He told the pursuers to stop hiding and asked how long they were going to follow him. A gang of teenagers, led by a big guy, came around the corner. The leader grinned, noting Ray's good instincts, and admitted that they were trying to be careful. Ray glanced coldly at the ringleader, recognizing Ron. He reminded him that he'd already warned him last time about the danger of the meeting. His eyes glittered menacingly. Ray repeated his threat. If he ever caught Ron's eye again, he'd make sure he couldn't walk again. Ron only laughed in response. He mockingly asked if Ray thought he'd be allowed to leave like last time, and demanded that he just hand over the bag. The gang leader promised that if Ray handed over the bag, they would let him go unharmed. His gang surrounded the boy in a threatening manner. Ron smiled nastily, showing off his knocked-out teeth, and gave a short snicker, confirming his words and anticipating an easy profit. But Ray calmly replied that Ron was lying. He was sure that they would never let him go, even if he complied with their demand. He glared at Ron, mentioning an old saying that went around among the local children in these dangerous ruins. A phrase full of dark mystery rang out among the ruins. A ghost lives on 17th Street. Ray stood still, ready for anything. Legend had it that the white ghost was silent and emotionless. And I shouldn't have looked him in the eye, or all the lies would come out. Ron roared with anger, calling Ray a selfish jerk. Without thinking, he clenched his fists and lunged forward in a furious attack. He shouted that he was about to make sure Ray could never utter another word again. The ghost calmly set the bag on the ground. However, Ray easily intercepted Ron's punch. His movements were quick and precise, and he stopped his attacker's fist with no apparent effort. The ghost easily dodged a clumsy swing from Ron, who clearly hadn't expected such agility and strength from the skinny guy. In one sharp, honed motion, Ray struck back. His fist slammed into the jaw of a stunned Ron. Ron flew backward and collapsed to the ground. The impact was so strong that the gang leader was instantly unconscious. Ray straightened up, looking calmly at the defeated Ron and the remaining gang members who were frozen in shock at what they saw. One of the guys in Ron's gang swore, calling Ray a bastard, their faces contorted with anger and fear at the same time. The remaining bandits looked at each other. One of them shouted furiously, urging them all to attack Ray and kill him for what he'd done to Ron. One of the guys, armed with a bat, yelled, "Die!" and lunged at Ray, swinging for a blow to Ghost's head. But Ray again showed incredible reactions. He easily blocked the bat and at the same time delivered a devastating counterpunch. The guy with the bat, Peter, fell to the ground after Ray's blow. The rest of the bandits looked on in horror, shouting the name of their fallen comrade. Ray didn't stop and immediately kicked the next attacker. His movements were swift and ruthless, giving his opponent no chance. Ray's face was splattered with blood, but he remained calm. His glowing eyes stared coldly at the defeated enemies around him. He stood over the bodies, looking at the rest of them. Ray made it quietly clear that no matter how many people they brought in, it wouldn't make a difference. Ron, lying on the ground and coming to his senses, hissed hatefully. He mentally called Ray a bloody monster, not believing his strength. When he saw Ray walking towards him, Ron crawled backwards in panic. He begged Ghost to stop and not to come any closer, full of fear. Ray stopped in front of Ron. He calmly reminded the gang leader of their last meeting and of the promise he'd broken then. He reminded Ron of his warning. Ray had promised to make sure Ron couldn't walk again if he got in his way again. In desperation, Ron snatched the knife he'd been hiding behind his back. He cursed to himself, his face contorted with fear and anger at Ghost. Ron lunged at Ray with his knife in desperation, screaming at him not to come any closer and calling him a monster. He was willing to do anything to survive. The word monster hurt Ray. He wondered, looking at his reflection, and thought that maybe Ron had been right about what he was. He remembered his childhood when he was about 10 years old. It was then, he thought, that he had begun to realize that he was different from others. He remembered the incident when he had gotten a wound on his leg. It was bleeding, but he only stared at it in surprise, not feeling the usual pain. The other children then surrounded him. They didn't understand why he wasn't in pain and why he wasn't crying, and he just didn't understand why he should cry in pain. There was another incident. He'd been told that their friend Kale had been beaten up by some kids from 7th Street, but Ray hadn't been angry, which surprised the other kids again. He didn't understand why he should be angry, or what anger even was. Even when their friend Bello had died, Ray hadn't shown any emotion. The other children looked at him warily. They whispered that there wasn't a tear on his face, that something was wrong with him and he was scaring them. Eventually, the children just walked away, leaving him alone. One of them called out to the other, and they withdrew. It was then that Ray realized everything about himself. He sat alone in the ruins under the light of the moon. He realized the bitter truth. He could not feel what people called emotions. Looking up at the night sky, he wondered if he could be wrong. Deep down, he desperately wanted to be like the others. Ray thought back to his lonely childhood. He always wondered if he would ever understand what real human emotion was. He reflected that even now, 6 long years later, he still felt nothing inside. But he had learned to read the emotions of others. Ray looked at Ron sternly, reminding him of the rule. He said sternly that you can't use blades in fights here, his eye glittering menacingly. He asked Ron if he'd brought the knife from the beginning to stab him. Ron mumbled fearfully that he'd picked it up from the trash recently. Ray instantly recognized the lie. He explained that it was easy to tell by the color of the energy vessel he'd seen in Ron's chest. He had the ability to see the world differently than others. Ray perceived that there was a small energy vessel inside each person. When someone was feeling an emotion, this vessel would fill with certain colors of mana. Traces of anger, hatred, and love were displayed in red. Mockery and despair became blue mana. Joy and enthusiasm in turn became glowing yellow mana. Besides these basic ones, there were countless other colors and shades reflecting the entire spectrum of human feelings. It was these bright colors of other people's emotions that had filled Ray's world since childhood, replacing his own missing feelings. Ron screamed in panic, threatening to stab Ray if he made a move. The dark energy of fear swirled in his chest. Ray saw that deep black mana. He had no trouble identifying it as a manifestation of very intense, all-consuming fear. Despite the threat, Ray calmly stepped forward. Ron cried out in horror, begging him to stop immediately, his voice shaking. Ray stopped right in front of Ron. He said coldly that liars like Ron deserved to be treated a certain way. His eyes flashed with blue light. Ray held out his hand, declaring that Ron deserved to be punished for his lies and despicable intentions. After dealing with the gang, Ray turned and walked away. He headed toward the dark, damp tunnel under the bridge. He approached the hidden passage, pushing aside the thick cloth. A familiar voice called his name from the darkness. Inside, he was greeted by a group of children. Their leader, a smiling boy named Pale, waved to him. happy for his timely return. The little kids immediately jumped on Ray, hugging him. Pale asked them not to hang on to their big brother, for they were heavy. The whole group sat in a circle in their underground shelter by lantern light. Pale offered to see what Ray had gotten for them today. They gathered by the dim light of the lantern. On the floor lay a modest booty, some bread, a couple of chocolates, and a handful of coins. The children looked expectantly at the food. Pale wondered if it would be fair to divide the crumbs among the 7 hungry people. Ray watched them silently. A somber mood hung in the air, the children clearly worried about the lack of food and uncertainty. Then Ray silently held out his bag. It was full of food, bread, canned goods, water. The children gasped with delight at the abundance. The children cheered, one asking if Ray had gotten it all from the golem. Another added that the golem had taken nothing from him, admiring Ray. Ray mentally explained to himself, the golem only took items with residual mana. Without the ability to see that energy, it was impossible to give it anything. Pale clapped his hands happily. He announced that it was time to share the food and added that thanks to Ray, they wouldn't go hungry today. Pale began to distribute the food, first holding out a portion to the youngest, Josephine, who gratefully accepted it from his older comrade. Ray stealthily stepped aside as he watched Pale pass out food to the other children. He felt a little disconnected from their joy. He sat alone in the rain, pondering the fact that they never had enough food for everyone anyway, and that was their constant problem. Looking in the distance at some large building that looked like a warehouse, Ray wondered if he should risk going there for supplies. He felt responsible for these children. It was his duty to support the group, for it was they who had once saved his life. Memories took him back a year. He was lying unconscious in the snow, freezing, when someone in the distance called out to the other boys. It was Pale and his group. They found Ray in the snow and decided not to abandon him, but to pull him out and help him survive the harsh conditions. He was carried through the blizzard. Ray was so devastated then that he didn't mind just dying out there in the cold snow. But he woke up later, surrounded by the concerned faces of the children. They asked if he was okay, their voices full of genuine concern. Their eyes glowed with concern and relief. He realized that these unfamiliar children had saved him from certain death by giving him a second chance. That's why Ray considered it his principle to repay all debts. Whether it was a simple favor, like saving a life, or unavoidable revenge on those who had wronged him. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Pale walked over to him, noticing that Ray was thinking about something of his own, sitting apart from everyone else. Pale said that Ray should get his portion too, because he deserved it more than anyone else tonight. Ray sat next to Pale, refusing the offered food. He assured his friend that everything was fine and he wasn't hungry at all. Pale smiled slyly, noticing that Ray's stomach seemed to disagree. Ray remained silent, a little embarrassed at the sound. Then Pale broke his cookie in half. He grinned and offered to share their modest meal with Ray as a brother. Holding out half a cookie, Pale suddenly asked Ray if he could hear anything unusual outside their shelter under the bridge. They listened to the sounds outside. Pale noticed that it had started to rain black, and Ray briefly confirmed his observation. Pale shared a rumor. It was said that this strange rain came because the mages had once used too much magic. He added that almost all of these mages now lived in sectors with smaller numbers, in safer and wealthier parts of the city. Pale speculated that the golem Ray had encountered must have been sent by the mages too. Ray ate a cookie, thinking that the golem might have been just a machine. Ray briefly contradicted his friend, disagreeing with the idea that the golem could have been an ordinary soulless machine without magic. Pale, however, insisted enthusiastically. He was absolutely sure that this stone giant moved only because of magic power. In his heart, Ray was in complete agreement with Pale. He knew the truth about the golem's nature, which he kept hidden from the other children for their peace of mind. He mentally visualized the golem drawing mana from its surroundings to its core as if absorbing the energy as it moved. This collected mana was then mixed inside the golem. It was then released to the outside in the form of a black, swirling gas. Ray couldn't help but think that the phenomena were connected. The black rain outside and the black gas coming from the golem seemed connected. Suddenly, Ray rose to his feet, interrupting the conversation. The surprised Pale looked at him questioningly, not understanding his intentions. Ray announced that he needed to go outside for a while. Pale couldn't believe his ears, asking if he was going to go out in such a heavy black rain. Without waiting for an answer, Ray ran out into the rain. Pale panicked and shouted for him to wait, but Ray was already gone. Pale sighed frustratedly, running a hand through his hair. He mumbled something to himself, worrying about his reckless friend. Ray ran through the deserted streets in the black rain. It was said that when it rained like this, everyone hid for fear of it. People believed that even one drop of this rain could cause disease. But Ray jumped fearlessly across the rooftops in pursuit of his goal. Ray wasn't afraid of the black rain. He mentally noted that he could protect himself from it, and that made his job much easier. He reached his target, the lame Hector's grocery warehouse on 18th Street. The building looked abandoned in the rain. Ray looked out the window and saw two guards. They were playing cards, one of them gambling, and one of them was raising the bet, going all in. Ray grinned to himself. He knew it. These guards always let their guard down on rainy days, gambling. He crouched against the wall and pulled out some kind of small device, probably to sneak into the warehouse past the guards. Thanks to the distracted guards, the warehouse's defenses were greatly weakened. Ray slipped inside easily, finding himself in total darkness. There were hundreds of different types of mana in the air. Ray sensed them with his special vision, preparing to use his unique ability. He concentrated, drawing only certain types of energy from the air. Then he began to mix them according to a formula he knew. A small flame erupted in his palm. It was red mana, the energy of anger and hatred that he had been able to concentrate. Ray admitted to himself that he didn't have a clear method, but he'd learned to use it pretty well. Though red mana was harder to control, he thought it might have had something to do with his inability to feel emotions. He tried to create a larger flame by concentrating. Suddenly, a knife whistled past his head. It slammed into the wall right next to him, causing Ray to turn around in surprise. Ray froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He realized that someone had originally been hiding in the warehouse, waiting for him to appear. A mocking voice sounded out of the darkness. The unknown man called Ray the little rat that had finally shown itself and asked if he had come to steal rations. Two uniformed guards with knives appeared. They had night vision goggles on their faces, and they grinned at Ray. One of them mockingly suggested that Ray could make it up as much as he wanted, clearly underestimating him and considering him easy prey for them. Ray quickly assessed the situation. There were 3 men against him, and worst of all, they knew exactly where he was in the dark. He hadn't expected them to have such equipment. The night vision goggles gave them a huge advantage in the darkened room. The guard shouted again that it was useless to hide. They would find him anyway. Immediately after that, more knives flew at Ray. But Ray was ready. He dodged the flying blades with incredible agility, his body moving swiftly and precisely among the boxes. One of the guards exclaimed in shock, unable to believe his eyes at the sight of this boy appearing so suddenly in front of him. The other guard shouted to his partner to aim better. But he mumbled fearfully that there was something wrong with this guy. Ray cut the distance with lightning speed and delivered a crushing blow right into the guard's face, shattering his night vision goggles. The guard flew back to the boxes and fell unconscious. The other 2 looked on in horror, one of them cursing at Ray. They couldn't understand how Ray could see them in total darkness. One of them wondered aloud, full of bewilderment and fear. Ray could see their emotions clearly with his ability. He could feel their rage, mixed with genuine surprise at what was happening. One of the guards, trying to hide his fear, told Ray not to play dumb and lunged forward, swinging his knife. His blade flashed with red mana. The guard attacked Ray, putting all his anger and determination into the blow. Ray watched his opponent carefully. He watched the mana flow from the guard's energy vessel through his arteries. He concentrated, his gaze fixed on the glowing blade. The energy of the enemy was visible to him like the palm of his hand in the darkness of the warehouse. Because of this, Ray could predict the guard's next move. He stepped forward, preparing to intercept and counterattack. Ray easily dodged the lunge and struck back. His movement was so fast that the guard didn't have time to react. The guard recoiled, unable to believe his eyes. He shouted that it was impossible, unable to understand how the boy could move like that. Ray coldly corrected him, telling him he was wrong. His fist was already flying toward the target, leaving his opponent no chance. With a loud scream, the guard flew back from the powerful blow. Ray used his opponent's inertia to throw him away. He landed easily as the body of the last guard flew into the doorway. Ray was left alone among the defeated enemies. A new figure appeared in the doorway, a large bald man. He said he'd come to see what all the fuss was about. It was Gumphrey, the enforcer for Hector's group. He looked over the defeated guards and noted that it looked like all 3 brothers had been taken out. Humphrey clenched his fist threateningly, lightning crackling around him. He glared contemptuously at Ray, calling him a little rat. Ray recognized Gumphrey and realized that the rumors weren't lying. He was truly frightening. Ray decided he had to get out of here right away. Ray punched Gumphrey in the chest, but he didn't even move. The boy was shocked at the incredible resilience of his formidable opponent. Gathering his wits, Ray boldly offered the bulky man a chance to try and dodge his next attack, his gaze full of determination. Gumfrey's eyes flashed red. He lunged forward, delivering a powerful blow with a hand surrounded by the same red energy of anger. Ray struggled to dodge the lightning-fast lunge. He realized that Gumfrey was not only strong, but incredibly fast for his size. Gumfrey's powerful fist slammed into the floor where Ray had just stood, kicking up dust. The boy barely had time to bounce aside. Humphrey straightened, looking at Ray in surprise. He recognized with a wry chuckle that the boy was a fast opponent. Ray looked at Gumfrey carefully. He realized that this formidable opponent was undoubtedly on a completely different level of strength. He instinctively assumed a fighting stance. His gut told Ray that the situation was truly dangerous for him. Looking at Gumfrey's massive figure, Ray realized one thing. He knew instinctively that he couldn't beat him one-on-one. If he couldn't beat him in a fair fight, then... Ray narrowed his eyes, quickly considering a new plan of action against the big man. Humphrey stood waiting for the next move, energy glowing in his chest. Ray decided he would aim for his exposed points. Ray began to gather red mana in his palm again. His eye flashed with the same fiery light. He was preparing to use his power. Gathering enough energy, Ray threw his arm forward sharply, aiming the fire charge straight towards Gumfrey, hoping to distract him. When the smoke cleared, Humphrey stood still, looking around. He muttered that he had lost sight of the boy after the sudden flash. Outside the warehouse, Humphrey was giving orders. He shouted that Ray couldn't have gotten far after the fight and told him to find him and figure out where he'd run off to. The guards were combing the area in the rain. Ray lurked nearby, knowing that if he was discovered, he would be in trouble. One of the guards noticed movement near the entrance. He shouted loudly to the others, pointing to where Ray was hiding among the shadows. The guards rushed toward Ray through the bushes, cursing. They shouted that they would kill him and urged everyone to pursue the boy at once. Ray ran away through the dark forest or park. He thought about how he'd searched the warehouse of that notorious and dangerous group of Hectors. He was racing through the night. If they found him, they would kill him. But Ray wasn't afraid of death. His resolve was unshakable. Ray was rushing through the darkness, but he wasn't thinking about his own death. He knew that if he died, the children who depended on him wouldn't last long. Besides, he couldn't afford to die now. He would never be able to repay his debt to those who had saved his life. Suddenly, one of the pursuers spotted him among the trees. The guard shouted loudly to his partners that this was where the fugitive was. Ray mentally cursed. The chase was catching up with him, and it was getting harder and harder to hide in the pouring black rain of the night forest. The guards shouted orders to catch him. Ray kept running, looping between the trees, but the pursuers kept up with him. He stopped abruptly, realizing he had run into a dead end. There was no farther to go, and he was wedged between the wall and the guards catching up with him. One of the guards was breathing heavily behind him. He mumbled in amazement as he wondered why the hell this little juvenile was so fast. The other guard blocked the escape route. He stated the obvious. The kid had nowhere else to run. He was trapped. Two guards approached Ray threateningly with knives. One of them angrily ordered him to return the stolen goods before he put a hole in his stomach. Ray looked around quickly. He didn't see Gumfrey, the formidable enforcer he'd encountered earlier in the warehouse, around. Since Humphrey wasn't there, then... Ray clenched his fist, red mana surrounding him. He felt that now he had a chance to win. One of the guards shouted impatiently to see if Ray was deaf. He lunged forward, swinging his fist to strike the boy. But Ray was ready. He met the guard's blow with his fist shrouded in red energy, blocking his opponent's attack on the spot. The second guard didn't wait. He attacked from behind, trying to stab Ray in the back while he was distracted by his partner. The guard shouted in amazement at how Ray could be so strong. The boy blocked the knife's blow while fending off another. Ray turned around sharply and punched the second guard. His fist flashed with yellow mana, the energy of joy and excitement in battle. The guard flew away from the blow and collapsed to the ground unconscious. A light smoke rose from his body after Ray's powerful attack. Ray stood over the defeated enemies, breathing heavily. He could hear the noise nearby and realized that there was no end in sight for the enemies, and his magic was unstable. He looked around, and his gaze fell on a large garbage can nearby. It seemed to him the only possible hiding place. The pursuers were approaching, cursing and wondering where he had gone. They shouted that they could not let him go and continued their search. Ray hid inside the tank, holding his breath. He could hear the guard's footsteps fading, moving away from his hiding place. When it was quiet, Ray peered out cautiously. He was relieved that they hadn't found him after all, that he'd escaped the chase. Ray decided to wait until morning in his hiding place. He realized that if the pursuers followed him to the bridge, the children would be in danger. Sitting in the dark among the trash bags, he closed his eyes tiredly. Ray wondered when the endless black rain would finally end. The next morning came. The sky was still covered with gray clouds, but the ominous rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Ray opened his eyes, realizing he had fallen into a dream right there. He cautiously lifted himself up, still feeling tired after the night's events. He made his way out of his temporary shelter, clutching the knife in his hand. Ray hoped there wouldn't be anyone left here now, but his hopes were not realized. He stopped abruptly, noticing someone ahead of him, and quietly stated that he had found one of them. One of yesterday's guards stepped out of the shadows. He stood with his back to Ray, hiding his knife behind his back, clearly waiting for him to show up. The guard turned around gloatingly, showing the knife. He said with a chuckle that it was a good thing he had decided to come back, his chest blazing with red mana. Ray assessed the situation. Judging by the color of the guard's vessel, he was incredibly angry. Ray had not yet fully recovered from the fight. The guard noticed the knife in Ray's hand. He said with a sneer that the boy also had a weapon, calling him a real man. Since Ray was armed, the guard cheerfully announced that he wouldn't have to hold back. He threw himself into the attack with a fierce shout. The guard was screaming madly that he was going to kill him. He was coming at Ray, waving his knife, determined to finish him off once and for all. Ray met the attack. He used the hood of his cloak to block the knife strike while moving out of his opponent's line of attack. However, in the process of struggling, Ray stumbled. He swayed, losing his balance for a moment, which gave the guard a chance to strike. The guard grinned maliciously, drawing his knife for the final blow. He hissed goodbye to Ray, calling him contemptuously a rat. But Ray had time to react. He dodged, and the guard collapsed to the ground. Blood splattered on the wall as Ray struck back. Suddenly, a calm voice sounded behind him. Someone said it was dangerous, addressing Ray, and pointed a strange weapon at him. Ray turned around and saw a familiar guy with black hair and a cigarette. It was Niels, the boss of 17th Street, known for his strength. Niels stepped closer, glancing carelessly at the defeated guard. He repeated again that it was dangerous for Ray, his tone calm. Niels asked Ray who had called him here. He noticed that Ray was usually still asleep at this time. Ray briefly confirmed his words. Niels nonchalantly explained that he'd heard Hector's guys looking for someone, so he'd come to check out what was going on. He spotted the canned food jars at Ray's and asked if Hector had stolen them, chuckling as he called him crazy for taking such a risk. Ray thanked Niels, but the man cut off that it wasn't a compliment. Ray quietly admitted that it was actually quite difficult. Ray thought to himself that people like Niels were always difficult to deal with. He had rarely met people like that in his life. He looked at Niels again, taking note of the peculiarities of his mana. His emotions were so monotonous that the vessel almost never filled completely. Niels advised Ray not to take so many risks, because at this rate you could die, adding that it was better not to touch some people. Ray objected that otherwise they would starve to death. Niels sighed, saying that now he had repaid Ray for his rescue. He admitted that he'd fished him out of the river only because of the bag of supplies. He hadn't thought to help. Ray calmly replied that it was still thanks to Niels that he was still alive, despite his original motives at the time. He also reminded Niels that he had long since paid for that incident when Ray had gotten him out of trouble a long time ago. Ray remembered the events of a year ago. He had accidentally pulled Niels out of the river. He had been a performer from another sector who had been betrayed by his own. Ray didn't think Niels had lied at the time, telling him about it. The fighting lessons he'd given as payback for the rescue had been pretty structured. Ray decided to change the subject and turned to Niels about what he had said earlier. Niels threw down his cigarette and asked in confusion what it was about. Ray asked Niels directly about joining his organization, about the possibility of becoming part of his team at 17th Street. He firmly stated that he was joining his group. Ray decided that if he joined Niels' organization, the children would be safe. Niels hummed thoughtfully, looking at Ray carefully, pondering his sudden decision and offer to join the ranks. He turned to Ray, his gaze growing serious. Niels called Ray's name again before asking his main question. Niels asked Ray directly if he could use magic. Ray was shocked. He hadn't expected Niels to know about magic at all. Niels smirked, saying, "Bingo, so he was right." He admitted that he'd thought he was hallucinating when Ray had started the fire without matches. Niels grabbed Ray's clothes sharply. He demanded that he immediately tell him everything he knew about magic, his voice intolerant of objections. Niels explained that he only knew a few things from a mage from his past organization. Magic used mana from the air, and few people could recognize it. Ray checked with Niels to see if the mage had said anything about the colors of mana, trying to understand the nature of his gift of seeing energy. Niels replied that there was no mention of colors. On the contrary, the magician claimed that mana could not be seen by the human eye. Then Ray wondered, standing beside Niels in the midst of a swirl of colors invisible to him. What then was he seeing with his own sight? Niels leaned over to Ray, irritably asking him if that was it, if he'd forgotten anything, and if the boy was getting into trouble. Niels tries to bum-rush Ray with a series of wild strikes but misses. Ray thanked him sarcastically. Niels accused him of doing it on purpose. Ray calmly asked what Niels would say to his request to join the organization. To his surprise, Niels replied with a refusal. Niels leaned back against the wall, lighting a cigarette. He was silent, looking away, leaving Ray puzzled after the unexpected rejection. Niels began to explain that all sectors are located along the Elton River. If you move upstream, you can get to other, better sectors. He supposed that Ray could probably escape from these slums. There, in other sectors, he could find a better life for himself. Niels felt that it would be too much of a waste to let a child with such unique abilities as Ray's die here. He asked Ray if he'd ever considered leaving Sector 50, even offering to find him a car. Ray reminded him that he was taking care of the children. Niels advised not to worry about it. He shared the idea of founding an orphanage for children. Ray was surprised to hear about the orphanage. Niels confirmed, adding with a chuckle that he would keep an eye out for street bums like Ray, and ruffled his hair in a friendly way. Ray looked at the faded colors of Niels' mana. He wasn't sure if he was telling the truth, but he remembered that Niels always kept his word. Niels grew serious and warned Ray to be careful. He said it looked as if Hector was preparing for a real war. He said that he had seen whole trucks coming to Hector's house. These trucks were fully loaded with various weapons. Ray calmly replied that he knew about it. Niels playfully flicked him on the forehead, surprised at his awareness of such serious matters. Niels explained the gravity of the situation. The use of firearms in any conflict between groups meant a direct declaration of war. Ray remarked that if Niels lost this war, the people in the stores under his protection would suffer. Niels replied that his protection was worth something. Niels was indignant, demanding that they stop treating him like an old man since he wasn't even married. Ray replied nonchalantly that he was old anyway. Niels, furious, took another swing at Ray, but he easily dodged the blow. Niels cursed irritably at his miss. At that moment, a car pulled up. The man inside told the boss that it was time for them to leave. Niels agreed briefly, nodding to the driver. Getting into the car, Niels warned Ray. He said that it would soon be a real battlefield here, and advised him to find another hiding place, handing him something. In Niels' hand was a small vial with a green medical emblem. Ray looked at the unexpected object with bewilderment. From the car window, Niels tossed Ray an instruction. He told him to treat the wounded ear with the remedy, holding a cigarette in the corner of his mouth. The car sped away, leaving Ray alone in the middle of the street. He watched the car drive away under the frowning morning sky. Ray returned to 17th Street, finding himself near Central Square. He was familiar with the landscape of the neighborhood. He saw Josephine, one of the children, sitting next to a blind elderly woman named Viola. The boy cheerfully called out to Ray. Josephine ran up to Ray, his face glowing with happiness. He noted worriedly that Ray hadn't returned last night. The boy looked at Ray carefully, his joy replaced by anxiety. He asked why he looked so shaken and tired. Josephine assumed that Ray had been fighting and asked who had done that to him. Ray just waved it off, saying it was okay. He'd just fallen. Josephine's eyes filled with tears and he sobbed, imagining how much Ray was in pain. Ray could see the boy's mana shimmering with different colors of emotion. Ray handed Josephine the cans of canned food. He told her to take them to the tent and tell Pale that he would be right over, stroking the boy's head. After seeing Josephine off, Ray walked over to Viola. He asked the blind storyteller if she had told the boy anything special. Viola smiled warmly at Ray. She replied that she was just telling Josephine her usual tales of the distant and magical rainbow. Ray asked Viola not to fill the children's heads with fantasies because they needed to get used to the harsh reality. The old woman objected softly. Looking at Viola, Ray noticed an unusual emotion. He wondered what that strange purple mana emanating from her was. That unique purple mana surrounded only Viola. Ray had never seen it in anyone else, and it intrigued him. Ray grew serious and warned Viola of the danger. He advised her to go to another street, because war might break out here soon. Ray went on, leaving the old woman sitting on the steps. Viola watched him thoughtfully, noting to herself the young man's kindness. The next morning, Ray arrived at a familiar store. He knocked on the door, pretending to be a delivery man and calling out the word, "Delivery." The shopkeeper asked in surprise what that meant. He'd heard that Ron was now a delivery man, but Ray noted to himself that Ron wouldn't be here anytime soon since he'd broken both his legs. Ray asked if the owner was going to evacuate because of the coming war. He replied that there would be no visitors anyway, and he had nowhere else to go but his store. The boy asked his master what he was talking about. He suggested hopefully that maybe there wouldn't be a war at all, that everything could still be all right. The owner pointed to a closed door at the back of the store. He explained that Hector and Niels were talking there now, and if the negotiations went well, war would be avoided. At that moment, the door opened, and Hector's men came out. Hector himself was in the lead, accompanied by Gumphrey and another subordinate. It was Hector, the 18th Street boss. His face was crisscrossed with scars, and his gaze was cold and hard as he looked around the store with his tenacious gaze. He noticed Ray, who was standing indoors. Hector noted with a chuckle that the kid worked where almost all the adults had fled. Hector gave Ray a fatherly pat on the head. He advised the boy to do his best, because that was the only way to survive in this cruel world. Then Hector handed Ray 2 coins. He told him to take them and treat himself to something, as if rewarding him for his diligence and courage. Hector ordered his boys to leave. Ray watched them silently, saying goodbye quietly as they headed for the store's exit. As he passed, Humphrey cast a long, hard look at Ray. His face remained impenetrable, but something in his gaze alerted Ray. Ray touched the patch on his ear. He realized Gumphrey remembered him, remembered their confrontation in the warehouse last night and the wound he'd inflicted. Hector called out to Humphrey, asking why he was standing at the door. Hector called out to Gumphrey, asking why he was standing at the door. The shopkeeper breathed a sigh of relief as he watched Hector's car drive away. He was glad those dangerous men were finally gone. Ray touched his ear thoughtfully. He realized that Humphrey had remembered the wound, but he couldn't understand why the man had left without saying or doing anything. The shopkeeper ran excitedly to the door where the negotiations were taking place. He called out loudly to Niels, asking what was wrong. Niels sat inside alone, his look grim. The shopkeeper froze on the threshold, seeing the expression on his face and understanding without words. Niels looked up and briefly delivered the disappointing news. He said that their negotiations with Hector had completely failed. He lit a cigarette, his eyes staring into the void. With a heavy sigh, Niels stated the inevitable. The war was now destined to happen. The shopkeeper incredulously asked Niels if he was serious about starting a war and negotiations failing. Niels irritably explained that he couldn't accept stupid conditions like Hector taking over their organization. The owner lamented that it was the worst possible outcome, and it looked like he wouldn't be able to open his store for a long time to come. Niels turned to Ray and advised him not to leave his hiding place anytime soon for his own safety in these troubled times. Ray nodded silently and went outside. He thought about the fact that if war broke out, he wouldn't be able to walk around the neighborhood so easily. So he decided that it was necessary to find as much food as possible before the fighting started, to ensure that the children would have supplies for a long time. At that moment, an unfamiliar black sports car raced past him at high speed, raising a spray from the sidewalk. Ray caught a glimpse of the driver behind the wheel of the car. To his surprise, it was Gumphrey, the formidable enforcer of Hector's band. The boy frowned as he looked at the car. He had never seen such an expensive car in Sector 50th, and it seemed very suspicious to him. His intuition told Ray that there was something wrong here. He decided to look into it and follow Humphrey and his strange automobile. Ray secretly followed the car to 18th Street. He saw Humphrey pull up to the entrance to the base of Hector's group. The car stopped at the base gate. Ray hid nearby, wondering who else might have come to meet Hector in such a car. Hector personally came out to greet the guests. He smilingly told those who arrived that they had been awaiting their arrival for this important meeting. An elegantly dressed man with a monocle stepped out of the car. Hector invited him inside, calling him Mr. Mage respectfully. Ray, hiding in the bushes, watched in amazement. He couldn't understand who this mysterious and important person was. Using his ability, Ray sensed the stranger's mana. It was dark blue, almost black, and it was incredibly abundant, just like that golem. But there was something else strange. Ray saw some strange rings that encircled the man's energy vessel. A lot of mana was also felt around these rings. It seemed to Ray as if he was using them to limit his immense power. Ray instantly realized the danger of the situation. This man, who was called a magician, was incredibly powerful and posed a threat. He decided that he had to warn Niels immediately. It was urgent to tell him about this mysterious and dangerous magician. Ray hurried back to 17th Street to the base of Niels's group. They were already hard at work there, people preparing for war, people asking about supplies. He found one of Niels's men, a red-haired guy. Ray quickly asked him where Niels himself, their boss, was now. The red-haired boy turned around and was shocked to see Ray. He wondered how the boy had gotten in, since the entrance was guarded. Ray replied nonchalantly that he had passed through the open gate. He repeated his question, impatiently asking where Niels was at the moment. The guy explained that the boss had gone outside to prepare for war. He rudely told Ray to scram, as it was too dangerous here. Ray realized that he couldn't directly tell this guy about the mana, but he had to pass on his important warning to Niels. He asked the boy to give Niels one message. Ray told him to tell him to watch out for the man with the monocle, who was very dangerous. Ray looked at the sleeping children covered in blankets. He thought about the fact that the war probably wouldn't last long in this sector. Pale sat next to Ray, leaning against the wall. He asked his friend uncertainly if he thought the war would be over in a week. Pale asked Ray who he thought would win. Ray replied that he didn't know, since both groups were almost equal in strength. But Ray's mind was firmly made up. Niels had to win. It was necessary for the safety of the children who depended on their protection. He anxiously imagined the worst outcome. If Hector won this war, the children would likely be sold into slavery without mercy. Suddenly, Pale jumped to his feet when he heard a noise outside. He whispered fearfully that it sounded as if the war had already begun somewhere very near. Ray and Pale froze, shocked by the sudden rumble. Their eyes widened with surprise and a sense of impending disaster. Pale excitedly asked Ray if he had heard the sound. Ray listened tensely and briefly confirmed that he had heard it too. Ray raised his head, peering into the darkness. He'd never heard a rumble like that before, and he sensed that something was wrong. Meanwhile, a battle was raging on 17th Street. Niels's men shot desperately, trying to hold off the onslaught of the enemy in the darkness. A huge stone golem appeared in the thick of the battle. The soldiers cried out in surprise, noticing fresh scratches on it, and wondered what had happened to it. Suddenly, a powerful column of blue energy struck from above. The attack was incredibly strong, sweeping away everything in its path with a bright flash. Hector's men screamed and scattered from the impact. They were easily defeated by the unknown force that fell upon them. One of the surviving guards stared in horror at the aftermath of the attack. He couldn't believe his eyes and muttered a curse in shock. Raising his head, he saw the golem towering over him. The guard cursed again, full of fear and impotent anger at the monster. At that moment, an elegant man with a monocle under an umbrella appeared. He wrinkled his nose and squeamishly noted that the neighborhood smelled of slop. The man approached the shabby golem. He calmly addressed it, calling it his creature, confirming his authority over it. The mage then gave orders to his stone servant. He told the golem to scrub the place clean, to remove the traces of the recent short battle. Ray and Pale heard the approaching sound of the golem's footsteps. Pale whispered fearfully as the sound grew louder and louder. Ray stood up abruptly, but Pale grabbed his arm, asking where he was going. Ray replied that it wasn't business as usual. He sensed danger. Pale fearfully begged Ray to take him with him if he was going to leave, not wanting to be alone in this dangerous place. But Ray gently refused his friend. He told Pale to wait here in their hideout because it was too risky to go outside. At that moment, a sleepy Josephine appeared, wiping his eyes. The boy wondered why they were still up so late. Pale rubbed Josephine's head affectionately, apologizing that they had woken him up. He promised they would be back soon and told them to go to bed. Ray called Pale's name again before he left. He needed to make sure his friend understood the gravity of the situation. Pale nodded, agreeing with Ray. He promised that he would stay with the children and protect them until Ray came back. Ray reminded him that the children were not to be left alone for even a moment. But he still hesitated, feeling the need to check the situation. Pale asked Ray not to go too far away and to come back as soon as he knew everything. Ray promised he would be back soon and left. Ray reached the site of the recent battle. The street was ablaze, the bodies of Neil's defeated fighters lying in pools of blood everywhere. He walked over to the injured red-haired guy he had met earlier. Ray quietly asked him what had happened here in the meantime. Ray looked around at the horrifying scene of destruction around him. The flames were devouring the buildings, and the air was filled with smoke and the smell of burning and death. The wounded boy struggled to answer Ray. He wheezed that those bastards, Hector's men, had brought a huge battle golem with them. He added that this golem was controlled by the same mysterious man with the monocle who had come to meet Hector. The boy bitterly admitted that they couldn't stand up to such power. The golem and the mage were too strong for their group. Gathering the last of his strength, he looked at Ray. The wounded fighter whispered weakly to the boy to get away from here as soon as possible. Ray stood silently among the fire and the bodies, looking at the dying man. He understood the gravity of the situation that loomed over his friends and home. He realized that at this rate, Neil's group would definitely lose this war. Ray clutched the knife, deciding that he had to help him at all costs. At the same time, horrific events were also unfolding on the bridge where the children's refuge was located under the protection of the remaining Pale. The bodies of the murdered children were everywhere. Pale sat on the ground, covered in blood, and hugged Josephine's lifeless body in despair. Pale's face was distorted with horror and grief, tears flowing down his cheeks, mingling with blood. He could not believe the tragedy that had happened. The huge golem loomed over Pale, its hand reaching for the boy. Pale whispered in horror the name of his friend, his only hope, Ray. Pale mentally pleaded with Ray not to come back here, to this terrible place where only death and grief awaited them. Ray hurried back down 17th Street in the Central District, but he was met only by a picture of utter destruction and fires all around him. He stopped in the middle of the street, horrified and in pain. Ray realized bitterly that he had been too late, that he had not had time to prevent the disaster. Bloody bodies lay wherever one looked. They were the corpses of Niels's men, his fighters, who had fallen in unequal combat with the enemy. Ray looked around at the fallen, searching for a familiar figure among them. He didn't see Niels, and there was a faint hope that he was still alive. Suddenly, Ray heard the distant sound of an explosion or impact. He turned around sharply, trying to determine the source of the ominous rumble. His heart clenched with foreboding. The sound came from the direction of their hiding place under the bridge. The tent? The thought pierced Ray with horror. He realized that the danger had reached the most precious thing he had left. His children. Ray rushed toward the shelter. He saw a huge blood-covered golem at the entrance, blocking his way in. Ray's face contorted with rage and despair. His eyes flashed a bright blue light, and he prepared to fight to the death. Without thinking for a second, Ray rushed at the huge golem. He attacked the stone monster with all his strength and pain, but the golem was too strong. In one powerful blow, it threw Ray back as if he were a piece of fluff, sending him flying. Ray collapsed heavily to the ground, feeling a sharp pain throughout his body. But even wounded, he was determined, thinking he had to make sure. He coughed up blood, struggling to lift his head. He had to make sure they, his children, his family, were all okay. At that moment, a faint, barely audible voice reached him. Someone was calling him Big Brother Ray, full of hope. Ray looked up sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. He couldn't believe that any of the children could have survived the carnage. Happy memories flashed before his eyes. The children were calling him excitedly, asking him to hurry up, their laughter echoing in his ears. He remembered how they had greeted him, asking if he had returned. Their innocent smiles and cheers seemed unbearably distant now. But then he saw Pale's face, full of bitterness and regret. His friend was mentally saying that he didn't want Ray to come back here. And the last vision was of Pale leaning over a dying girl. Her name was Lorraine, and Pale called her name softly Leah. The faces of his dead friends flashed before Ray's eyes. He saw Corden, then Miles, their lifeless stares haunting him in the darkness. Then came the images of Josephine and Pale. They were all dead, killed in that cruel and senseless massacre under the bridge. Ray reached out to touch Pale's body, his lips whispering a single word. No. This shouldn't have happened to them, to his family. He fell to his knees, choking on a silent scream. Ray thought bitterly that he had not yet repaid them for all they had done for him. Suddenly, Ray's head snapped up as he heard a strange sound. Something was approaching, breaking the silence of this place of sorrow and death around him. That sound, it was the same as during the battle. The ominous hum was coming from the energy core he had seen before. And then Ray realized. It was the golem that stood before him, shrouded in blue energy. He had killed them all, cold-bloodedly and mercilessly. He was responsible for the death of children, innocent and defenseless. Their little bodies lay lifelessly lying around, torn apart by this monster. The golem also destroyed Niels's men, his loyal fighters. Their corpses were scattered everywhere, becoming mute witnesses of its destructive power. It killed all the people of this street, leaving no one alive. An entire neighborhood was plunged into chaos and death because of this stone monster. Ray's face contorted with rage and all-consuming pain. He swore to himself that he would avenge them all, everyone the golem had taken from him. The golem began to gather energy to attack again. Therefore, Ray had to act to fulfill his oath. Gathering the last of his strength, Ray struggled to his feet. He had to move at last, to face the enemy. The golem's huge stone leg rose above Ray. It swooped down with incredible speed, ready to crush him on the spot. But suddenly, the heavy black car crashed into the golem at full speed. The unexpected collision interrupted the monster's deadly attack. The golem flew aside from the powerful impact, losing its balance. The car flew past, leaving a trail of destruction on the sidewalk. The car door opened, and a familiar red-haired guy jumped out. He shouted anxiously to Ray, asking if he was all right. The guy quickly ran up to Ray, who was still reeling from the shock and unexpected rescue from certain death. The man helped Ray to his feet, examining him. He was relieved that Ray didn't seem to have broken any bones in the mess. Ray looked down at his bloody, trembling hand. He whispered softly the name of Niels, his mentor, the friend he couldn't find. Niels realized with horror what had happened to the children. His face contorted with a sudden terrible guess at the fate of Ray's charges. He looked around at the devastated 17th Street. The rain was washing the blood off the pavement, and there was devastation and death from the attack. Niels walked over to Ray, who was sitting on the ground, and apologized, saying he was late. He felt guilty about what had happened to the children. Ray objected through tears, asking why Niels blamed himself. He himself felt that he hadn't been able to protect them in time. Looking at Ray crying, Niels himself could not hold back his tears. He painfully whispered the boy's name, sharing his unbearable grief. Then Niels hugged Ray tightly, trying to comfort him in the middle of this nightmare. It was a gesture of desperation and support in the cold rain. Ray recovered a little and asked Niels about his men. The boss replied grimly that all his subordinates were dead. A complete rout. Niels clutched his head in rage, cursing Hector. He hadn't expected that he dared to call for help from the mages in the other sectors. Ray, looking at the despairing Niels, asked what he intended to do now, after all this chaos and loss. Niels replied that he would go back to the street to look for survivors first. The fight with Hector could wait. People were the most important thing now. Suddenly, a blue energy blast pierced through Niels. He cried out in sharp pain before he could defend himself. A huge golem emerged from the darkness, the very messenger of destruction. It was his fist that had just struck Niels from behind. Niels looked at the glowing hole in his chest in bewilderment. Ray stood next to him, horrified at what he saw. Bleeding, Niels grinned crookedly and muttered a curse. He knew the wound was fatal, but he didn't give up. Losing his strength, Niels settled heavily into Ray's arms. The boy picked him up, not believing he was losing his mentor right now. Ray's hands were instantly wet with Niels' blood. He stared at his palms, trying to realize what was happening. Ray held Niels' collapsed body in desperation, confused, asking what was happening. His world was crumbling before his eyes. Suddenly a memory flashed before Ray's eyes. Young Niels teaching him how to fight by the fire, smiling and encouraging him. Another snippet from the past. Niels smiles warmly and calls him by name. These bright moments seemed unreal. Returning to the cruel reality, Ray looked up. A golem with burning blue eyes loomed over him and the dying Niels. Ray's gaze was bloodshot, his eyes red with fire. The rage inside him was a fury that promised terrible vengeance on his killers. All around stretched the scene of destruction in the black rain. Blood and sweat mingled on the wet pavement, mute witnesses to the brutal battle. Ray leaned over Niels, horror in his eyes. He called softly to his mentor, clinging to his last hope that he was still alive. The boy hugged Niels' body tighter, desperately wishing that this was all just a terrible dream from which to awaken. But reality was inexorable. Fury seized Ray again, eyes flashing scarlet, and he reached out a bloody hand toward his enemy. His fire mana clashed with the ice power of the golem. Red and blue flames clashed in a fierce confrontation of energies. The golem gathered its blue energy, preparing to strike again. A sinister, cold grin seemed to distort his stone face. Ray concentrated all his pain and anger. A clot of bright red, pulsing mana of destruction swirled in his palm. Two spheres of pure power. Ray's fiery passion and the ice power of the golem rushed towards each other, ready to explode. The collision produced a blinding flash. A wave of energy swept across the street, shaking the ground and air around the fighters. In this chaos, Ray's thought resounded. He is different. He's not a soulless machine designed for destruction, not like his opponent. His power was fueled by feelings. He was a man with emotions. It made him vulnerable, but it also gave him real power, and he unleashed the full force of his emotions on the golem. A stream of unstoppable red energy rushed forward, sweeping away everything in its path. The golem's stone flesh couldn't withstand the pressure. Cracks crept up its body, and it began to crumble under Ray's blow. When the energy ran out, Ray lowered his arm. He was breathing heavily as he looked at his defeated foe, but his gaze remained steady. The battle was over. The scarlet trace of his power still smoldered on the ground. Ray, utterly devastated, sat on the wet pavement. He immediately turned to Niels, gently shaking him by the shoulder. Ray begged him to wake up, not to leave him alone now. Ray's eyes were filled with despair. He kept saying that Niels must not die, that he must survive no matter what. Niels struggled to open his eyes and weakly asked Ray to stop shaking him. He hissed that he was hurting like hell. He admitted that he had always known he would not die peacefully, but he had never expected that his end would come today. Niels looked into the void, saying he had no regrets whatsoever. He thought he had accomplished a lot for the pathetic scavenger he used to be. He reflected that if he had started trying earlier, perhaps things would have turned out differently. His fate might have been different. The dying man added that he meant Ray's age. The boy listened to his words, sitting beside him, covered in blood and despair. Ray wanted to get up for the medicine, but Niels held him back with a weak hand, calling his name quietly, stopping his impulse. With a final smile, Niels asked Ray to leave this cursed place. He wanted a better fate for him. He whispered insistently for Ray to find a better place, where there wouldn't be so much dirt and pain, where he could live a different life. An image surfaced in Ray's mind of Niels rubbing his hair, confessing that he had always thought of him as his little brother. Niels gave one last admonition. Swim upstream on the river of life, but be careful on the dangerous rapids of fate. He encouraged Ray, confident in his strength. Niels believed that the boy would cope with all the difficulties that lay ahead. Niels's eyes closed forever. Ray stared at his lifeless body, his hand still stained with his mentor's blood. A wild scream burst from Ray's chest. Rage and despair were the first strong emotions he consciously felt. Later, he woke up alone, sitting among the rubble under a bridge, where there had once been a home for the children and himself. Total loneliness. Ray looked at his hand, realizing that he seemed to have slept for a very long time, probably passing out from grief and exhaustion. Memories of last night's nightmare came flooding back. The murdered children, Peel, Niels dying. Images of horror stood before my eyes. The thought of Niels being pierced by the golem's blow reignited a storm of emotion almost as strong as it had been at that moment. He remembered the golem's red eyes and realized something about that battle, about his power, was definitely not as it should be. Sitting in the ruins, Ray created a small flame of mana. He noticed, the stronger the rage, the bigger the flame. Emotions fueled his power, but the concentration of energy caused a sharp pain. Ray clutched his head, realizing he'd overdone it, trying to control the power. He rose to his feet, looking at the devastation around him. A firm decision had matured. We had to get out of here. Leave to get revenge. Ray threw his hood back on, eyes glittering with determination. Whether he could win or not, he had to try. The central square of 17th Street had been taken. Hector's men were roughly driving the prisoners, and the signs of the recent battle were everywhere. The bandits discussed Hector's victory, realizing that their power was now strengthened. One whispered to the other to be quiet, lest they be killed. The hooded Ray watched stealthily from behind the barrel as two of Hector's patrolmen stood by the black car. He was tracking the enemy. One of Hector's men spoke angrily of Niels, believing that he was to blame for his own death for not listening in time. Ray's hand clenched, enveloped in the red mana of rage. He had found them, the ones responsible for the destruction of his world, and he was ready to act. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed Ray's shoulder. Gumfrey, Hector's enforcer, called out to the boy, asking him to wait a second. Ray struck Gumfrey without a second thought with a fist shrouded in red energy. The bald man was caught off guard by the reaction. Humphrey gasped at the sudden blow to his neck, but stayed on his feet. Ray's attack left only a small bloodstain. Humphrey shouted at Ray to calm down. The boy bounced back, ready to continue the fight with a dangerous opponent. Ray recognized him. It was Humphrey, Hector's right-hand man. Cold determination reflected in the boy's eyes as he drew his knife. Hector's entire group had to die for what they had done. The thought burned in Ray's mind as he prepared for the fight. Humphrey was amazed. He did not understand how the boy could have such crazy, sharp movements, full of deadly force. He remembered their last confrontation. This guy hadn't been so strong then. Something was different about the 17th Street Ghost. Humphrey frowned, realizing that with such an opponent, he might well lose. He had underestimated Ray's fury and strength. Then the big man decided to act. He lunged forward, striking a powerful blow straight at the body of the man opposite Ray. To Ray's surprise, it was as if Humphrey had been deliberately stabbing him, wounding him in the shoulder. The boy didn't understand the maneuver. Humphrey threw Ray to the ground with a powerful blow. He didn't finish him off, but stopped the fight with his strength. Looking down from above, Humphrey asked Ray if he had chosen such a foolish death for revenge. He tried to understand him. Humphrey called him by name and nickname. Ray, the ghost of 17th Street. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. The bully looked into Ray's eyes and said that he had a proposition for him. The situation took an unexpected turn. Humphrey confessed to Ray that he had been watching him for a long time. So he urged the boy to listen to his proposal to the end. Humphrey's nickname, the Silent Man, was not given to him for nothing. He was known for always doing his work silently and efficiently. But now there was a look of despair on the normally unruffled man's face. Ray sensed that Humphrey was not going to deceive him. Intrigued and still wary, Ray asked what exactly Humphrey wanted to offer him in such a tricky situation. Humphrey demanded that Ray leave Sector 50 immediately. The surprised boy asked the reason for the strange request. The reason turned out to be personal. Humphrey had asked Ray to find his younger brother, whom he had lost years ago to Hector. He bitterly explained that it was Hector who had sold his little brother to the mysterious and dangerous city of Mages long ago. Humphrey admitted that he had only worked for Hector because he had promised to tell him about his brother after 10 years of service. Now the brother must be Ray's age. Ray asked skeptically why he would accept this offer from an enemy. Humphrey began to explain his motives patiently. Humphrey said he knew for a fact that Ray could use magic. The boy's glowing eye confirmed his guess. The thug touched his chest wound, stating that after their run-in in the warehouse, he had no doubts about Ray's abilities. But Humphrey warned, now, even using his magic, Ray could not defeat Hector alone. It's certain death. The reason was simple. Next to Hector now, there was always that terrible, incredibly powerful mage, his new dangerous ally. The blue-black mana of this mage caused shivers and animal fear. Humphrey thought he was a true demon, not a man. He remembered how the mage had instantly frozen anyone who dared to defy him. An ice statue was the fate of those who disobeyed him. Humphrey also told how a magician once mercilessly drowned a man by simply encasing his head in an impenetrable water bubble. Yes, this elegant man in a suit was a terribly cruel and powerful mage, a most dangerous opponent for anyone. So Humphrey advised Ray to leave the place for now, to survive at all costs, to have a chance for revenge later. Ray realized he was right. Ray pondered. He had never learned magic, relying only on intuition. His enemy was an expert. His chances of winning now were zero. Humphrey shared a rumor. The city of Mages is upstream on the Elton River. Only true mages are said to be allowed there. Humphrey handed Ray a weighty pouch. He said it was all the money he'd saved in his life, and inside was a note with his brother's name and description. Ray asked incredulously why Humphrey trusted him with such a sum. After all, he could just take the money and not keep his promise. Humphrey answered confidently that he knew Ray. He was sure that the ghost of 17th Street was not the kind of man to break his word. Besides, the image of Niels surfaced in his mind, and he added that when he saw Ray in battle, he had no doubt. The guy could make it to the higher sectors. The thug clenched his fist, repeating the words Ray had heard from Niels before he died. He believed Ray was up to the task. Humphrey suddenly fidgeted, hurrying Ray. He warned that the other members of the group would be here soon, and they needed to decide quickly. Ray made a condition. The boy demanded that Humphrey take care of all the bodies under the bridge, giving them a proper burial. Only then would he find his brother. Humphrey smiled slightly and agreed. He promised that he would definitely do it, fulfill Ray's request without any questions asked. Ray gave Humphrey one last glance, telling him to wait for him. Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the alley, leaving the big man behind. Ray ran quickly through the deserted streets of the ruined sector, his cloak fluttering behind him. He promised mentally that he would return. He stopped for a moment and looked back. When he was sure there was no tail behind him, Ray exhaled with relief and adjusted his hood. He approached an elderly woman, Viola, sitting on a crate against the wall of the house. She was the blind storyteller from their street. Ray dropped a coin into her mug and said he had a question. He asked for a quick answer since he didn't have much time. Viola smiled warmly as she recognized his voice. She greeted Ray and wondered what question had brought him to her now. Ray seriously asked if the story about the rainbow she often told the children who lived under the bridge was true. He clarified whether it was true that when you find the end of the rainbow, you can make any wish and it will definitely come true. A conversation with one of the toddlers came to his mind. The boy excitedly asked if Ray knew what a rainbow in the sky was. The kid imagined the rainbow as a long, multicolored ribbon after a rainstorm, like a beautiful, overbitten donut. The boy with burning eyes added that if you find the end of it, you can make a wish. He thought it was very cool. The memory was interrupted. Ray thought about the donuts the kids were asking for. A boy nearby tugged at him, angrily asking if he was even listening. Ray was distracted, remembering the kid's request for donuts. A boy shook him, calling him a stupid idiot. Ray figured he'd deal with it tomorrow. Viola confirmed with a smile that rainbows existed. But whether to make a wish or not was his own business. It was up to him to decide. Ray watched her carefully. Her mana was clear, calm, as violet-colored as ever. He couldn't tell if she was telling the truth. Gumfrey's words that a magician had once searched for something here came to mind. Ray wondered if he meant rainbows. If that powerful magician was also looking for rainbows, that was important. So he had proof that it really existed. Ray had a crazy hope. He asked Viola if it was possible to raise the dead with this rainbow. The old woman smiled enigmatically and evasively replied that who knows what a rainbow can really do. She perked up, adding that they say it's as if you can make a wish and absolutely any wish will definitely come true. However, Viola continued, no one knows where all the rainbows are. They must be somewhere very, very far away in some unknown land. Ray thanked Viola for the information, albeit vague. Any clue was important to him now on the road to revenge. Before leaving, Viola advised Ray to get out of here as soon as possible. The boy nodded and quickly disappeared into the alley, following her advice. He made his way to the outskirts of Sector 50 to 23rd Street. It was another abandoned and dangerous place. Ray crouched in a dark corner, looking at the note. He thought it was the place Niels had written about, but something made him wary. In his hand, he held a crumpled sheet of crude map. A blue abandoned building next to a white one, a red dot indicating the location. Suddenly, a white car came around the corner and stopped at the exact spot. Ray realized that he had found what he was looking for. He walked over to the car. He remembered Niels's words that he would at least have transportation ready. Niels had left him a 4-seat sedan. Ray reached for the doorknob and noticed a note pinned to it. He wondered who it could be. At that moment, a man appeared behind him. When he saw Ray at the car, the stranger thought he was Niels's henchman. A man with scars and disheveled purple hair blocked Ray's path, asking if he'd been given orders to bring the car around. Then he grinned unpleasantly and asked Ray where Niels himself was. He obviously didn't know about the death of the 17th Street boss. Ray was angry, realizing that one of Hector's men was following him after all. He decided there was no more time to waste. The stranger lunged after him with a scream, trying to prevent him from driving away, and jumped right onto the roof of Ray's departing white car. Ray was already behind the wheel, his face a look of cold determination. He stepped on the gas, intent on getting away as quickly as possible. But the man managed to slip his hand through the window and grab Ray's shoulder. He realized he'd used up too much mana, and his strength was wearing off. Gathering the rest of his magic, Ray fired a concentrated beam of red energy from his hand directly at the bandit Hector had grabbed. The impact threw the man backwards. He fell out of the car and collapsed onto the sidewalk, unable to pursue Ray any further. Ray pushed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding away. The figure of the defeated pursuer was left lying on the road. Looking ahead, Ray was relieved that he was on his way to freedom, away from this nightmare. The car sped down the broken road toward the dawn, away from the ruins. Ray had finally gotten out of bloody Sector 50. Later, already in a safe place, Ray stopped and walked over to the trunk of the car Niels had left him before he died. Opening the trunk, he froze in surprise. There was so much stuff in there. Niels had taken care of it even after his death. The trunk was full of water bottles and paper bags of supplies. Ray thought his mentor had done a good job of preparing. Looking at the distant horizon, Ray estimated that it would take him several more long days of travel to reach the next sector. At night, he built a fire near the car. He decided that once he reached his destination, he would have to learn more about magic. Sitting by the fire, he pondered the little he already knew. There was one thing he knew for certain now. He realized that there were two basic types of mana, energy that he could see and control somehow. The first type was his native red mana. It could be used instinctively without any special training. Other mana, on the other hand, required mixing colors. To get it, you had to combine different energy flows, which was more difficult. Ray realized that controlling mana wasn't easy, but he noticed that strong emotions attracted certain types of mana faster. Remembering the deaths of Niels and the children, he focused on one feeling: fury. It just took thinking about rage to summon the power. Ray breathed heavily, realizing that this was his maximum. He realized that as soon as he lost focus on the emotion, the mana would slip away. Then he decided to try combinations. Multicolored streams of energy swirled around him. Blue, pink, yellow sparks of mana. He carefully gathered a few streams in his palms. The energy glowed with an unstable blue-green light with violet flashes. Ray leaned back, feeling tired. He realized incompatible types of mana destroyed each other when he tried to mix them. But he also thought that there must be some successful combinations. Ray decided to keep trying, despite the difficulties. Before, he didn't need to master complicated techniques. But now, after everything that had happened, circumstances had changed. Sitting by the fire under the starry sky, he watched the northern lights. Now he had good reason to grow stronger. The next day, the white car raced down the deserted road, kicking up dust. Ray continued his journey into the unknown. At night, sitting on the roof of a moving car, he practiced again. Multicolored ribbons of mana swirled around him under the moonlight. He stopped practicing after a while, deciding to stop for now. He needed time to think things over. As he lay on the roof, he thought about managing mana. If he could hold it in him like a vessel, it would be much more efficient. He remembered that mage. His dark power seemed to be held back by invisible rings circling the energy core. Ray decided that he would look for a way to improve his control when he got to 49th Sector. That became his new goal. Meanwhile, in Sector 50, Hector's men were combing 17th Street near the bridge, following orders from their boss. The mysterious mage grudgingly asked Hector's subordinate why there were still no results of their search. The man apologized fearfully to the mage. He promised that they would find the golem if he gave some more time. The mage silently pointed to the glowing tip of his cane. The subordinate did not understand what was required of him at that moment. Terrified, the man began apologizing again and begging to give them some more time. He was clearly panic-stricken with fear of the mage. The mage looked coldly at his subordinate through his monocle. He said he didn't like people who didn't understand him right away. Blue light struck from the mage's cane. The subordinate's hand began to freeze, and he screamed in unbearable pain, a victim of anger. The ice quickly stiffened the subordinate's body, turning him into a blue statue with a frozen scream of terror. The other bandit looked on with undisguised fear. The mage snapped his fingers indifferently. The ice statue fell and shattered at his feet, leaving no trace of the man. The mage scornfully called the slain man useless. At that moment, another subordinate shouted excitedly that there was something here. They were standing by a deep furrow in the ground. The subaltern suggested that a golem had fought here, and added that he had found a piece of it nearby. The mage felt the residual energy in the air. He noted that magic had clearly been used here, and there was still a visible trace of it. He headed towards the shelter under the bridge, noticing that the concentration of residual mana was much higher there. He could feel it. The mage summoned one of his subordinates, pointing toward the ruins. He ran up fearfully, awaiting his master's orders. After looking around at the remains of the squalid dwelling, the mage asked if anyone lived here. The subordinate confirmed that it had been inhabited by street children. The mage asked disdainfully if they were just vagrants. The subordinate agreed, saying that it was a favorable environment for them here, but they must have left. The mage hesitated, looking at the traces of magic. Could some vagrant really have used power of that level? It seemed unbelievable. Suddenly, the mage laughed loudly, making his subordinate freeze in bewilderment. He didn't understand the reason for his superior's amusement. The mage grinned, finding the idea that the street kid was seriously using magic amusing. He wondered if he had found the complex combination himself. He quickly dismissed the thought as impossible. Most likely another mage had come here and destroyed the golem. The mage had ordered him to find out. The elegant mage adjusted his suit, but a slight smile touched his lips. He wondered if the impossible, what if the impossible was possible after all? His gaze became thoughtful, as if he had seen something extremely interesting. He speculated that if it was true, this boy might turn out to be a genius. Perhaps he was destined to become an archmage like the world had never seen before. Meanwhile, Ray's white car had finally reached Sector 49. The scenery around him was noticeably different from the lower areas. The image of him sitting in the tavern with Niels came to his mind. A memory of home, of his lost homeland on 17th Street. Niels, sipping his beer, told him about Sector 42nd. He said it was as messy as everywhere else down there. He added that the only difference was the size. That sector was larger than the 50th, with taller buildings and more streets. Ray listened, sipping his drink. All the lower sectors are similar, he thought. The higher up the river, the more noticeable the changes. Ray stepped out of the car, amazed at the scale of Sector 49. The buildings here were huge, towering over him like impregnable fortresses. Ray was walking through an unfamiliar neighborhood in Sector 49. He was surprised to see local kids rummaging through the garbage and thought how strange it was. He looked around and realized that there were no golems here. Ray wondered if they could only be found in his native 50th sector. The boy walked down to the busy street. It was bustling with life, people talking loudly about the mines and laughing, not at all like downstairs. He found himself on 36th Street. Ray estimated that this sector was at least twice the size of 50th and decided to move on. He needed to find information about magic as soon as possible. He was especially interested in that mage and the rings around his energy vessel. Ray clenched his fists, his gaze turning icy. He was sure that this knowledge would be the key to his long-awaited revenge on Hector. He also needed to learn about mana colors and the legendary city of mages. And of course, he needed to get some money to live on. The boy sighed. He had Gumfrey's money for the first time, but he had no idea how long the whole dangerous journey would take. Ray's gaze fell on a sign above the entrance to one of the buildings. It read, Veronica's Bookstore. He stopped in surprise. He read the sign again. Veronica Bookstore. What was a bookstore? The word was completely unfamiliar to him. Ray lifted his head, scrutinizing the title. Veronica? It sounded like a person's name. But what did this strange place sell? The boy frowned in bewilderment. What was a bookstore anyway? He had never heard of such establishments in the slums before. Scraps of the past came to mind. Niels patiently teaching him the most essential words for survival in their cruel world. Hungry, gun, river. He remembered Niels drawing a circle on the ground with a stick, explaining the meaning of the word brother. So warm and unfamiliar to him. Niels made him repeat the words over and over again. It was thanks to these lessons that Ray could now read, even if only a little. Ray stepped inside and looked around, confused. What was this place? He'd never seen anything like this in his entire life down here. The whole huge space was filled with strange tall shelves. On them were rows of identical squares with writing on them. Suddenly there was an angry shout from above. A red-haired girl shouted from the window, accusing Ray of breaking the window and coming to steal again. She angrily demanded that he get away and stop stealing her books. Ray had no idea what she was talking about. Ray gingerly touched one of the squares. Books? Is that what those things in the store were called? He was very intrigued. The girl screamed in rage, ordering him to get out. She declared that she was not going to repeat her words twice. Ray could see her bubbling mana. Red excitement, yellow joy, blue discomfort. He wondered how it was possible to feel it all at once. She kept shouting from the window, warning that the adults were on their way down. Ray looked up perplexed, not sure what she was talking about. He looked up at her, his face impassive. The boy just thought to himself how strange she was. The girl stumbled back, questioning what he had just said. Her face contorted with indignation at his reaction to her screams. She flared up, asking how dare he call her that. The girl started shouting indignantly something about her grandfather. Ray turned away, deciding now was not the time for that. He left the girl screaming at the window and walked quietly away. The boy was walking down a busy street in Sector 49th. There were people around who looked and behaved very differently from downstairs. As he passed by, he caught glances from the locals. Two men gave him a stare of curiosity. The group of boys at the wall also eyed the stranger suspiciously. Ray realized that he was considered a stranger and a provocateur here. He grinned grimly to himself. Yeah, it was exactly the same here as it had been in his native 50th sector. Nothing had changed. At night, Ray lay in the car, covered by his cloak. He thought about the fact that he'd walked many streets, but he'd never found anything about magic. He closed his eyes, deciding that tomorrow he would have more territory to explore. The search was going to be long and arduous. Outside, under the cover of night, 3 men were cautiously approaching the car. One of them held a baseball bat, preparing to attack. Ray lay with his eyes open. He felt them approaching and thought quietly that they were finally here. He had been waiting for them. From above, the 4 could be seen surrounding the white car, lurking among the rocks and debris in the night darkness of the wasteland. One offered to kill him, but the leader said to just knock him out quietly without letting him squeak, and to find the keys and check the trunk for food. Suddenly, the car door swung open. Ray flew out and attacked the attackers with incredible speed, taking them by surprise. The leader of the attackers collapsed to the ground. The remaining 2 bandits cackled, not expecting such a swift repulse from their target. Another guy in a blue jacket tried to stab Ray, but he easily blocked the attack with his forearm, showing no fear. Ray knocked the knife out of his assailant's hand in one swift motion and immediately sent him to the ground after the leader. The 3rd bandit, a piece of pipe in his hands, swung at Ray from behind, shouting for him to die. He decided to attack from the sidelines, but Ray intercepted the pipe with a hand right above his head with icy calm, stopping the blow a moment before it collided. He straightened, looking at the frightened boy. He recoiled, mumbling fearfully to keep Ray away from him. Ray calmly snapped the pipe against his knee and coldly ordered the bandit to grit his teeth, preparing for the imminent retribution for the attack. The guy on the ground trembled with fear, unable to utter a word, awaiting his fate from this ruthless opponent. Now all 3 bandits were kneeling before Ray, beaten and frightened. Ray turned coldly to them with a question. He asked how many streets their gang was responsible for. The defeated boys were silent, hesitant to answer his question. Ray's eyes flashed with a threatening light. He demanded imperiously that they answer immediately, his patience wearing thin. The leader in the red cap shouted out in a panic that they only had 3 streets. He asked exactly what streets this guy was interested in. He stammered as he called out the numbers, 23rd through 25th. Ray sensed his emotions, anxiety, doubt, and obvious fear. Ray realized it was a lie. He stepped sharply onto the ringleader's arm, causing him to cry out in pain and admit his deception. The other 2 bandits watched in horror as their leader was massacred. They realized that they were dealing with a very dangerous man. The ringleader wailed, begging for forgiveness. He quickly revealed the truth. They had 14 streets and 52 gang members. He also gave the name of their leader, Kedrick, and said their base was in an abandoned factory. Ray noted that it was more than he'd expected. Ray shifted his gaze to the 2nd bandit he had disarmed and ordered him to raise his head, not daring to look away. He asked what the guy's name was. He stammered and introduced himself as Neshu. Then Ray asked what orders Kedrick had given them. Neshu, struggling to squeeze out the truth, their leader had ordered them to beat Ray to a pulp and take all the food from the car. Neshu added that their leader Kedrick also said he saw everything. He held a knife over the lying gang leader. Suddenly, Neshu jumped at Ray with a shout of "Die!" swinging his knife. He decided to attack while Ray was distracted. Ray met the attack calmly, blue mana enveloping his body. He realized that if Kedrick could see, he could see him. A powerful gust of wind threw all 3 bandits back. They didn't understand where the sudden burst of energy had come from. Neshu covered his face with his hand, complaining that dust had gotten into his eyes. He was disoriented by Ray's surprise attack. Before the bandit could realize it, Ray was at his side. A series of quick, almost invisible blows struck Nesha. Neshu unconsciously collapsed to the ground. His 2 companions looked on in horror, unable to believe Ray's speed. Ray grabbed Nesha by the hair, lifting his bloodied face. He said he would relay a message to their leader through him. Ray's eyes burned red fire. He hissed for Neshu to tell Kedrick that he wasn't the only one who could see things around here. The next day, Ray walked the streets of Sector 49th. He noted that here, as in the 50th, no one knew about magic. He had also heard that the books were stacks of papers with information. Ray wondered if there might be information about magic in there too. Immersed in his thoughts, he did not notice the 3 men approaching him. One of them called out to him, asking him to come with them. Ray was wary. The guy assured him with a sly smile that they weren't here to fight and advised him to relax. Ray bluntly asked if they were looking for him yesterday. The guy confirmed, saying that Ray had beaten Anthony, Horn, and Melber badly. He grinned, adding that Ray did it in his own style, and that was why their boss was interested in him, since he was a good fighter. The guy held out a folded piece of paper to Ray, offering to read a message from their boss who was impressed with his strength. He asked his companions if they could read the note, but they said they couldn't. He sighed, saying that the boss had told him to pass it on accurately. Ray took the note, saying he would read it himself. All three boys stared at him in amazement. One even shouted, "Can you read?" Ray nonchalantly replied that he could do a little, unfolding the note. The three bandits looked at him with disbelief and shock. They looked around, surprised. How could a street kid learn to read? They knew that only the boss and a certain waiver read. Ray unfolded the note. Kedrick was offering him a job, promising that he would never need food. The messenger asked impatiently what it said. The guy ignored the question about the note and instead asked the guys how their gang chooses a leader who makes those decisions. One of the guys replied that everything is decided through fights. The one who turns out to be the strongest becomes their boss, the main leader. Ray nodded, saying that was fine, and told them to go. The surprised bandits asked where exactly he was going. With a slight chuckle, Ray stated that he intended to meet with their leader Kedrick right now to discuss the proposal. They led Ray to the base of Kedrick's group. It was a large, abandoned factory that looked imposing and a little ominous. The messenger pointed to the main entrance, saying they had to go there, inside this dingy industrial building. Many people had gathered inside the factory. They stood in groups around the burning barrel, creating the atmosphere of a typical bandit's den. Cedric, sitting in a chair by the fire, noticed the newcomers. He recognized Ray and grinned, noting that this was what he looked like. A young boy with disheveled dark hair approached Ray. He wore a patterned jacket and confidently introduced himself as Kedrick. Ray only gave his name briefly in response, scrutinizing the local gang leader and his surroundings. His gaze locked onto the ring on Kedrick's finger, which glowed brightly with mana. Ray thought it was the first time he'd ever seen an object with such power. Kedrick gestured broadly for Ray to take a seat in the other chair by the fire, saying he had invited him as a guest, not an enemy. Ray accepted the invitation and sat down, finding himself surrounded by Kedrick's silent and wary men. The atmosphere was tense. Ray noted to himself that Kedrick had done a good job of showing his dominance. He appreciated his leadership skills for his age. Kedrick grinned, complimenting Ray on his nerves of steel. He asked where he'd come from, mentioning that he'd heard about his car. Ray calmly replied that he came from Sector 50, the lowest and most dysfunctional neighborhood of their dystopian city. Kedrick's men around him whispered. No one had ever heard of people coming up from Sector 50. It was usually the other way around, they doubted. Kedrick ordered his men to silence with an imperious gesture, quashing their whispers and doubts about their guest's origins. He looked at Ray with interest, stating that if that was true, it was simply unbelievable. And Ray is more than a match for their organization. Ray raised an eyebrow in surprise as he asked which organization he was referring to. The suggestion was unexpected. Kedrick smiled slyly, confirming his words. He explained that they were planning to join a real big organization themselves. He called it the Red Mercenaries. It was a super famous organization from Sector 45 showing their emblem. Kedrick explained that they had agreed to join the Red Mercenaries when they recruited 66 members for their gang. He asked Ray enthusiastically what he thought of the offer, thinking it was a good chance to raise his status. Ray nonchalantly replied that it was an interesting story, but his face didn't express much excitement at hearing the plan. Kedrick grinned, saying that it wasn't hard to join his group. Ray agreed that it was a wise decision, though. He firmly stated that he refused to work for anyone weaker than him. His gaze was direct and defiant. His words sounded defiant. Kedrick was shocked at the insolence. He asked disbelievingly if Ray had just called him weaker than himself. Ray calmly explained that in his native 50th sector, they had always chosen a leader solely on strength and not otherwise, and not by the ability to talk nicely and scratch their tongues, as it was apparently accepted in their circles in this sector. One of Kedrick's subordinates jumped up in a rage, calling Ray a bastard and yelling how dare he even speak to their leader like that. But Kedrick immediately grabbed the guy by the throat, angrily asking who even gave him the right to speak without his boss's permission. Kedrick's eyes flashed red. He hissed that he hated being interrupted. The subordinate babbled an apology in horror. Kedrick, surrounded by red energy, lifted the boy above the ground. Ray watched it, wondering if it was amplifying magic. However, upon closer inspection, Ray noted that Kedrick himself didn't seem to be using magic. The source of the power was something else. He realized That ring on Kedrick's finger exuded powerful mana. It was the ring that gave the gang leader this frightening power. Ray turned to the other thug and asked when this beating would end. He nervously replied that it never would until someone stopped. Ray touched his chin thoughtfully. He thought he could probably just break that magic ring on Kedrick's hand. Suddenly, Kedrick let go of his subordinate and laughed awkwardly. He apologized, saying he'd flared up a bit. Ray noticed this strange change of emotion. Kedrick offered to return to their conversation. He reminded Ray of what he'd said about thinking he was stronger than him, right? Then Kedrick offered to check it out right away. Ray calmly and briefly agreed, ready to accept the gang leader's challenge. Ray confidently declared that he was stronger. At the same instant, a powerful wave of his energy threw the chair next to him off. Kedrick, enveloped in the red energy of the ring, angrily demanded that Ray repeat his words, calling him a bastard. He turned to his men, menacingly asking if they thought Ray was stronger too. They assured him fearfully that Cedric was the strongest. Ray watched the scene quietly. He noticed that the ring on Kedrick's finger was clearly reacting to the emotions of its wearer. Judging by the way Kedrick hadn't reacted to his mana surge earlier, Ray realized the man didn't know what exactly this ring was doing to him. Kedrick turned to Ray again, smugly asking if he wanted to see his true power. Ray stood motionless. Ray then issued a challenge. He offered Kedrick a fight for the leadership position, promising to work for him if he lost. Kedrick smiled predatorily and agreed, but didn't schedule the fight until a week later, clearly having something in mind before the fight. He stated that they would fight in front of everyone, inviting not only their own people but also members of other groups to watch. Kedrick felt that this way they could be sure of each other's strength. Ray agreed briefly, accepting the terms of the fight. Before leaving, Ray inquired where Kedrick had gotten such an unusual and powerful ring, the source of his power. Kedrick touched the ring and replied with a chuckle that Ray would only know that if he could defeat him in the upcoming fight. But then he added with a sinister glint in his eyes that it would never happen, so sure was he of his victory. The next day, Ray walked the streets of Sector 49th, immersed in his thoughts about the upcoming battle and the strange ring. He was still pondering Kedrick's ring, not understanding its nature or how it could have such a powerful effect on its owner. Suddenly, he was blocked by a group of local bandits with bats and a hammer. They asked him who had authorized him to wander here. One of them mockingly called Ray crazy for daring to walk through their territory alone and looking like that. The ringleader warned Ray not to even think about running away, bragging that they had his men stationed everywhere for surveillance. He grinned nastily, promising to fix Ray's attitude. But Ray coldly interrupted him, ordering him to shut up and keep his mouth shut. Ray's eyes flashed red. He clenched his fists, repeating the order to shut up and demanding that he fight him if he dared. A moment later, Ray was on his way, leaving the defeated bandits behind. He realized that word of his challenge to Kedrick had already spread around the area. Ray pondered the upcoming fight, remembering Kedrick's crazed look. Even though the leader's group hadn't touched him as agreed, he'd only dreamed of peace. But the arrangement did not apply to the other gangs of Sector 49th. Their pride wouldn't let a stranger just walk their streets. Some groups have even started banding together to keep an eye on Ray, this outsider who has challenged one of the local bosses. Ray wiped the blood from his broken cheek after another skirmish. So far, everything was going according to his plan, despite the constant attacks. He could feel his power growing with each fight. The more he got used to the magic, the more powerful it became under his control. With the experience he gained, he could use magic faster, wasting less mental energy. Ray decided that provoking fights was a good idea. He stopped in the middle of the street, thinking about something else. By the way, there was a thought that was worth thinking about further. Ray turned around sharply, looking down the empty alley. He wondered how much longer the invisible watcher was going to watch him. A pair of worn boots stepped from the shadows into the light. Their owner stepped out of hiding, stopping in front of Ray in the street. It was a boy with glasses and a bag over his shoulder. He looked frightened and asked if he was really the hunter in front of him. Ray looked him over. The boy looked younger than his years, wandering alone and clearly not a fighter. Very strange for these parts. Ray looked at the bandits lying on the ground, then at the boy. He advised him to take off his glasses so they wouldn't accidentally shatter. The boy panicked. The kid threw up his hands in a frightened manner, assuring Ray that he hadn't come to fight at all. He had no such intentions. Ray was slightly surprised at this reaction. The boy didn't seem to be used to the mores of the local streets, where fighting was commonplace. The boy tried to calm Ray down by repeating that he wasn't a fighter. He even pointed to his frail body. How could he fight with that? Ray stopped scowling and asked bluntly what this boy wanted from him then, if he hadn't come for a fight. The boy nervously introduced himself, saying his name was Philip. He was clearly nervous, addressing the formidable Hunter. Philip then changed his tone to a more confident one and said that he had a very interesting proposition for Ray. He led Ray behind him through the debris piles, explaining that they needed to go to the east trash pit where he usually worked. Philip turned to Ray with a smile. He said he'd heard a lot about the Hunter since everyone around him was talking about him now. Ray looked thoughtfully at his bloody hand. He realized that the nickname Hunter had been given to him after the fight with the bandits. Philip led him to a large gray building. The boy announced that here they were at their destination, completing their journey. Inside, there was a lot of excitement. People scurried back and forth, some shouting for shoe polish, others complaining about their shoes. There was a hum of voices and a buzz of work. A man was loudly looking for a volunteer to be taken to 3rd Street, and life was bustling around him. Ray looked around in a daze. He muttered that this place was huge, amazed at the scale and the number of people around him. Philip, with a radiant smile, welcomed Ray to Philip's hotel, proudly introducing himself as the owner despite his young age. Ray estimated that there were more than 100 people here. Philip corrected him, clarifying that there were 186, counting those working outside. Ray noticed that all these people had something in common. Philip asked with a smile if he had finally realized what they had in common. He thought it would be difficult for these people to join another group. There were many children and very young teenagers among them. Philip complimented Ray on his powers of observation. He explained that there were many mines in Sector 49 where adults died, leaving orphans behind. He added that Ray wasn't just good at fighting. That's right. Because of the dangerous work in the mines, there was always a bunch of other work for those left without a breadwinner and a roof over their heads. Stores and workshops were happy to hire even children. There was so much work that street groups could not supervise everything. So instead of maintaining a monopoly of any one group, Philip negotiated with employers directly, paying them a little. He proudly called himself a broker of sorts. He found people jobs and even provided a roof over their heads, not for free, of course. Ray asked in surprise if Philip had created all this himself. He confirmed it vigorously, complaining how much he had to sweat. He was called out. A cheerful guy named Jonathan ran up to them. He told Philip that his work at the restaurant was going well and that no one was bullying him. Jonathan handed Philip a bag of money, the payment for the month. Philip accepted the money, saying that he would write it down now. The boy thanked Philip and ran off. Philip took out a notebook and a pen, preparing to make another important entry in his files. He carefully wrote down in his notebook that Jonathan had made the current month's payment. There were other entries, names, and notes all around. Philip turned to Ray, apologizing for the hitch. He explained that he had to label everything at once so he wouldn't forget anything. Philip handed Ray his notebook. He said it was the management records for his hotel and offered to take a look since he seemed interested. Ray picked up the notebook and began leafing through it, scrutinizing the entries made by the hand of this enterprising boy broker. On one of the pages, he saw his notes about Hunter. From Sector Da, lives in a car, fights well, scary looking. There was also a note, approach with caution. Philip said he'd done a lot of research. Philip was surprised to see Ray reading. He asked again if he could read. Ray answered briefly that he could read a little. The boy cried out fearfully, "Sorry," apparently thinking he had shown Ray his notes. Ray looked at him with mild bewilderment. Philip, trying to justify himself, said he just liked watching people. Ray hummed, noting that they were complete opposites. The boy asked to review the tapes, but Ray handed the notebook back to him, saying there was no need to apologize. He didn't care what it said or what Philip thought of him. Philip smiled with relief and took the notebook, glad to have avoided trouble with this dangerous guy. At that moment, Philip announced that they had arrived. 2 men were standing in front, waiting for them at the door to some room. One of the men, a younger man, asked Philip with a disgruntled look who the guy next to him was. The other man looked wary. The young man reminded Philip that they didn't let the first person they met into their hideout or office. It was their rule. Philip enthusiastically introduced Ray as the very Hunter everyone was talking about. He recalled that he had promised to bring him to visit. Philip led Ray inside the room, saying he was using the place himself, and suggested he make himself at home. Feel free. Opening the safe, Philip admitted that when he first heard about Hunter, he thought he was some kind of con man, not a real fighter. He pulled a baggie of money out of the safe and added that he was not a liar. In business, in his opinion, the most important thing is trust. Ray sat at the table, listening to Philip's arguments. The boy said that money could always be regained, but trust was hard to regain. Ray thought he looked nothing like his age. Ray decided to interrupt his philosophizing. He asked what was the matter, for Philip had said he had some suggestion. Philip clenched his fists nervously. He thought that Ray still scared him a little, but he needed to get over his fear for the sake of gain. He took a deep breath, extended his hand to Ray, and made his sincere offer to be his business partner for future endeavors. Philip clarified that this partnership would begin when Ray beat Kedrick and became the new leader of their street group. In the office, two men sat across from each other. One mysterious hooded man, the other young and observant Philip. The hooded guy pondered to himself, noticing that there was less dark energy in Philip than there had been before. He was surprised that Philip, who had been afraid of him before, had now clearly gained courage and looked confident without averting his gaze. Philip asked if his interlocutor thought he might lose. He replied that there was such a chance, but that victory was very likely. The surprised hooded guy asked why Philip was so confident in his chances of success in the upcoming case. Philip simply replied that he had such a feeling, an intuition telling him the outcome of events, as if he knew for sure. He reminded that he likes to observe people because in this way you can better understand their character by behavior and habits, learn their essence. Philip gave an example. His interlocutor almost always lowers his gaze when speaking, looking at his chest rather than into the eyes of his interlocutor. He admitted that he did not know the exact cause of this behavior, but suggested trauma related to people's eyes or faces. Philip then returned to the subject, stating that he was a good judge of character and could therefore say something else important about him. The hooded fellow was greatly embarrassed when asked what other habits this perceptive Philip had noticed during their time together. Philip continued his analysis. Coming out from around the corner, he always puts his right foot, subconsciously preparing for a possible enemy encounter. The boy was amazed. It was the first time he had heard such a precise and detailed analysis of his subconscious actions from anyone else. Up until that point, people had only seen him as superficial, thought he was strange, not like everyone else around him. This otherness frightened those around him, caused rejection and misunderstanding, making him feel very alone in the world. He was often told that there was something wrong with him, condemned for his coldness and detachment from the world of ordinary human emotions. All his life he has been perceived as either cold and emotionless or frightening and dangerous, without seeing his real self, his soul. He admitted to himself that even now he found it difficult to feel emotions other than rage or sadness. It took a special effort of will. But this Philip? Somehow he seemed to be the key to his own emotional development in the future, to the desired change. Philip, on the other hand, finished his analysis by noting that the guy often gives in to emotion in battle, unlike himself, always calculating. Philip expressed confidence in Ray's victory, but the man interrupted him. The young man looked away with icy calmness and agreed briefly. The boy broker exclaimed in surprise, for he had not had time to finish the thought. Ray, on the other hand, asked about the details of the payment, suggesting that Philip decide that for himself. Philip smiled broadly, assuring me that he would take everything seriously. He rubbed his hands together happily, confirming that it went without saying to him. But suddenly the business boy stopped the departing Ray. Philip said he had another important condition for their deal and partnership. Philip's gaze behind the glasses became sharp and penetrating. Ray noted to himself that the enterprising young man seemed to have extensive connections. Realizing this, Ray made his counter-condition. He asked Philip to use his powers to find something very important for revenge. 2 days of waiting flashed by. In the bright sunshine, amidst the mountains of garbage, Ray stood by his white car, immersed in his own unhappy thoughts. The mechanic Philip had sent was working under the car. The boy asked incredulously if the hunter had really come from dangerous Sector 50. Ray was silent. The mechanic looked out, noting the terrible condition of the car, as if it had crossed the desert. He added that Philip obviously trusted Ray to send an experienced craftsman. The boy asked Ray to hand him the wrench he needed. He also urgently needed a small 6mm nut for a quick repair. Instead of searching, Ray concentrated. Bright blue mana enveloped his hand, lifting the wrench and nut straight up into the air in front of the mechanic. The mechanic stared dumbfounded at the floating instruments. He muttered perplexedly, had they been lying right next to him all this time? Ray looked away, pretending to think about it. He shrugged, as if he hadn't realized how the tools had gotten into his hands. Soon the mechanic came out from under the car, wiping sweat from his forehead. He reported that everything was ready. The only problem was overheating and an old cooler. The boy lowered his voice and whispered to Ray in confidence. He confessed that he had secretly borrowed the most expensive cooler from the store where he worked. Ray approved. The mechanic immediately corrected himself, embarrassed, that it had been Philip's request. He gratefully called the young broker their mutual savior and benefactor. Without Philip, he explained, people like him wouldn't have jobs at all. Ray remembered Philip calling him Hunter and thought of his popularity. The mechanic slapped his forehead as he remembered another errand. He handed Ray the folded piece of paper he'd asked Philip himself to deliver in person. It turned out that Philip had not relied on the mechanic's memory. He had thoughtfully written down his important message so that nothing would be lost or forgotten. When he was done, the mechanic said goodbye cheerfully, calling Ray Hunter. He picked up his toolboxes and ran briskly away on his errands. Ray unfolded the note from the young broker. He was determined that he needed even the smallest information about the Mages for his revenge. Philip was revitalized when he heard about the Mages. He confirmed that he had heard of them and promised to gather all the information about anyone who had anything to do with them. Smiling confidently, Philip crossed his arms over his chest. He smugly asked who Ray thought he was, hinting at his broad capabilities. Ray stood by his car, staring in surprise at the voluminous report. He hadn't expected Philip to get so much data so quickly, in just 2 days. He scrutinized the list of potential mages. Baker Lennon, 42 years old, who carried a heavy bag with one hand. Clerk Andrew, 23, who ate bread without emotion. Ray's eyes widened at the sudden realization. He stared intently at the lines, a premonition that he was on the right track. Looking at the busy street of Sector 49, Ray made a decision. All the people on Philip's list had to be thoroughly cross-checked personally. He followed Lennon, the baker, carrying crates of groceries on his shoulder. Ray watched the man closely, but he didn't see anything unusual. Upon returning, Ray resolutely crossed the baker off the list. Lennon didn't have the very ring around the vessel mana he was looking for. Only the last candidate on his list of suspects remained. Ray slowly swiped the marker across the lines, crossing out another name on the report. The report mentioned a case where a pipe fell carelessly from a construction site. A helmeted worker at the bottom had only time to shout out the danger. The suspect was an unnamed construction worker from the empty commercial district of 32-1. A man in his 30s or 40s who often showed up between towns with food. But as the trumpet was falling, a strong wind blew. The stranger in the cloak and hat stepped aside quite nonchalantly, avoiding certain doom. Ray reread the lines again. The man's face didn't flinch a muscle. He didn't even look surprised, as if he knew what was going to happen. The stranger's behavior was too strange. Ray sensed it. There was a high probability that this man would be the mage he was looking for. Meanwhile, 2 teenagers stood at the closed door of the bookstore. One noted with annoyance that Veronica was out of business again today. The second guy asked with a gloating grin who would even open up if they were getting stoned every day. He suggested that it should stop, but the former sharply cut him off, calling him an idiot. Ray, who was passing by, heard their words. They were promised double payment if the store was put up for sale. The angry fellow picked up a stone from the ground, his eyes burning with excitement. He decided to mark not the store, but the second floor, right into the living quarters. He swung around, urging his partner to watch and learn. Their goal was not just to damage the property, but to get the owners to move out for good. Suddenly, an angry red-haired girl leaned out of a second-story window. She shouted angrily at the hooligans, demanding that they get out of here immediately. The girl clenched her fist and declared that she had heard everything. She accused the boys of throwing stones at their store, disturbing the peace. The bullies only laughed back, mocking her fear. They shouted enviously that she was lucky to have a home while they had nowhere even to sleep. The girl angrily told them to get out, calling them creeps. Ray noticed her light yellow mana of courage mixed with the dark mana of intense fear. One of the boys became nervous, shushing his friend. He told him to shut up, fearing that adults might hear the noise and go outside. But his comrade had already thrown a rock that hit the wall next to the girl. She cried out in fright, barely dodging the blow. The hooligans gloated and continued their taunts. They shouted that they knew that only children and a sick old man lived in the house, unable to defend themselves. The girl, with tears in her eyes and her face flaming with anger, screamed again. She begged them to be silent and to go away at last, to leave them alone. But the bully only grew angrier. He swung a new stone, threatening to aim it at her face this time. Suddenly, bright blue energy enveloped the flying stone. Ray's mana stopped it in midair, preventing it from reaching the frightened girl. The stone fell helplessly to the ground at the feet of the stunned boys. One of them mumbled perplexedly, trying to understand what had just happened. The red-haired girl froze at the window, looking at what was happening with wide-open eyes. She couldn't believe what had happened. Her hands were shaking. Ray was shocked as well. He saw a surge of mana, but was it coming from the girl? A thought flashed through his mind. Was she a mage? The boys looked at the window and at the fallen stone. They still couldn't understand what unknown force had prevented their attack. One of the hooligans nervously offered to try again, writing it off as a fluke. But his voice was not as confident as before. He hesitated. Ray watched the scene carefully, his gaze becoming serious. He was sure it wasn't an accident. It was definitely magic in action. The girl, exhausted, again weakly asked them to leave. She leaned against the window frame, feeling her strength leave her with fear and anger. But the bully was not going to back down. Furious at his failure, he swung the stone again, shouting that she was only playing the brave girl. The other one gave in, grinning maliciously. He was sure that from the window she could do nothing to them, thinking her completely defenseless. 2 stones simultaneously flew through the window. The hooligans were determined to finish their dirty deed by making the girl suffer. The girl clutched her eyes in despair, realizing that she wouldn't be able to repel both stones. She was sure she was finished, her strength gone. But then Ray intervened. His hand flashed with a bright blue mana light, creating an invisible shield against the stones flying at the girl. A powerful gust of magical wind swirled around the bullies, knocking them to the ground. They yelped, not realizing where the storm had come from. Suddenly, one of the boys howled in pain. The small but mana-charged pebble Ray had thrown hit him squarely in the eye. The second bully turned around in horror at his friend's scream. He could not believe his eyes as he saw his accomplice writhing in unbearable pain. The wounded guy grabbed his eye, which was bleeding. He struggled to ask his friend if he was okay, not believing what had happened. Ray stood calmly in the middle of the street, monocle in hand. At his feet, the downed bully was writhing in pain, unable to get up. The red-haired girl looked out the window at her savior in a daze. She didn't know what to say, mumbling only, "It's been a long time." Later, the battered bullies sat on the stairs inside the house, recovering. One moaned in pain, complaining of an injured leg from the altercation. The girl walked out to Ray and bowed low. She thanked him profusely for his unexpected help and rescue from the brutal attackers. Ray stopped her, telling her that thanks were unnecessary. He added that he wanted to ask something, to which the girl reciprocated with a mutual wish. They looked at each other, and the question came off their lips at the same time. Both wanted to know if the other was a mage, for they had seen the power. Their gazes met, complete understanding reflected in their eyes. Ray only exhaled a short, "Ah," confirming her guess about his abilities. The girl looked embarrassed, covering her mouth with her hand. She coughed and, a little nervously, suggested to Ray that he come inside the store to talk quietly. Ray followed her silently. They entered the cozy room of the bookstore, filled with shelves of books and the warm light of a lamp. The girl turned to him with a friendly smile. She introduced herself as Veronica and said she lived here at the Veronica bookstore. The young man gave his name briefly, Ray. Veronica nodded, repeating his name as if memorizing her unexpected savior and guest. Veronica embarrassedly apologized for yelling at him earlier. She explained that she had mistaken him for one of the hooligans. Ray calmly accepted her apology, admitting that the situation had been confusing. Veronica thanked him fervently again, saying there would have been trouble without him. Ray asked her not to thank her so much. He explained that he just wanted to look around this bookstore, pursuing his goal of finding knowledge. Veronica questioned him incredulously, wondering if he'd really just come to look around. She thought to herself, what a strange guy Ray was. They sat down at a table among the bookshelves. Ray didn't beat around the bush and asked Veronica directly where she'd learned magic. Ray leaned toward her sharply, his blue eyes burning with curiosity. He excitedly clarified whether her grandfather could also possess magic. Hearing her nervous confirmation, Ray immediately asked to see him. Veronica happily agreed and promised to go upstairs to warn her grandfather. But suddenly the girl cried out fearfully, noticing something on his face. She pointed to Ray's cheek, where a small, fresh cut was visible. Ray touched his cheek, realizing he'd been slightly hurt during the altercation. He wanted to brush it off, but Veronica was worried about possible contamination. The girl gently took his face in her palms. She asked him to wait just a second so she could quickly help with the wound. Her hands were enveloped in a gentle, pearly white glow. Veronica concentrated, directing a stream of healing magical energy to the cut. A moment later, the light went out, and Veronica removed her hands with a smile. She reported with satisfaction that everything was ready. The wound had healed. Ray jumped up abruptly, his eyes wide with amazement. He demanded an explanation of how she had done it, for she had moved white mana. He stared at her, unable to hide his shock. Ray explained that she had created light from that white mana and healed his wound. The thought of white mana flashed through his mind. No matter how many times he tried, he could never move or control that special energy. An image of pure white mana appeared before his mental gaze. He knew that it only responded to absolute confidence and determination, or to an act of self-sacrifice, like those children of his dead family. Those feelings were far from Ray, almost devoid of emotion from the young man. Veronica looked completely confused by his violent reaction. She shrugged, saying that she had just used healing magic. Ray looked at her seriously, trying to figure it out. He questioned what she meant by white mana, since that was what he had seen. He remembered his mentor Niels's words that mana was invisible. Ray understood. Mages really couldn't see its colors the way he could. Veronica confusedly suggested that he might be talking about the regeneration element. Ray asked in surprise about the unfamiliar word element. Veronica began to explain, drawing a diagram in the air. The regeneration element was the basis of the healing she had just applied. Ray clarified how many of these elements existed in total. Veronica answered that there were a lot of them, more than 20 natural ones, and about 100 in total. Ray clenched his fist, realizing that he had learned something new about magic today. He wondered if he could find out more by talking to Veronica's grandfather. He clarified whether the grandfather was on the second floor by looking at the stairs. Veronica confirmed, adding that the old man was very ill and almost unable to get up. The girl asked Ray to wait for a minute downstairs by the stairs. She wanted to go up and see if her sick grandfather was awake to talk. Veronica quickly ran up the steps, promising to return soon. Ray was alone in the quiet bookstore, waiting for her to return to him. Left alone, Ray walked over to the tall bookshelves. He looked at the spines, reading to himself the unfamiliar and complicated names of the books. The young man ran his finger over the cover of one of the books. He remembered hearing about the high price of books in this world. They were a real luxury. He looked at his palms, soiled after his recent life on the streets. Ray thought it would be wrong to touch such expensive things with dirty hands. Ray covered his nose with his hand, remembering the last time he'd washed in the clear rain. He felt no discomfort from the odor, but the others might notice. He wondered to himself at Veronica's behavior. Did she have a bad sense of smell, or was she just too polite to point out his unkempt behavior? His attention was drawn to a table on which a stack of old notebooks lay. Ray thought they didn't look like regular books, more like journals. He stepped closer and read the embossed inscription on the cover of one magazine. It was some sort of doctrine of the distribution of the elements into sectors. Ray touched another magazine lying nearby. Its headline read, "On the Cause of the Spread of Black Rain?" It seemed important to him. At that moment, Veronica came down the stairs. She called out in surprise, not seeing Ray where she had left him waiting at the bottom. The girl asked confusedly into the void, wondering if he had left because of her long absence. Ray appeared quietly behind her back, answering that he was still here. Veronica jumped in surprise and shrieked loudly. She turned around sharply, looking fearfully at Ray, who had suddenly appeared behind her. She realized with embarrassment that Ray was just looking around the store. Veronica blushed, realizing that she hadn't noticed his presence at all. Ray asked if there were any books about magic here, since he couldn't find any. Veronica wondered if he could read the titles of books. The girl looked at Ray with renewed interest, her gaze changing. This guy was much more interesting than she had thought, she thought. Ray inquired about her grandfather's condition, reminding her of the purpose of the visit. Veronica sighed, informing him that she couldn't talk to him now. His grandfather had fallen asleep again. Veronica looked hopefully at Ray, timidly suggesting that he come back tomorrow. The young man nodded briefly, agreeing to come back the next day to talk. Ray was already gripping the door handle, about to leave, but Veronica stopped him. She wanted to clarify something before he left the store. The girl asked curiously why he was so insistent on meeting her grandfather. She noticed that it sounded like his original goal. Ray turned around in the doorway, flooded with light from the street. He answered calmly and firmly that he was looking for an artifact called a prism. It was evening, and the clock read 16:30. Ray decided to go in search of the suspicious man on Philip's list. He arrived at a small cafe near the target's residence. Ray took a table by the window to make it easier to observe. Sitting at the table, Ray reread the information from Philip again. The unknown man from the 32nd building, in his 30s or 40s, was showing up at a certain time. Ray was pretty sure this mystery man had to be passing through here somewhere. His schedule was pretty predictable for a stakeout. He looked carefully at the street through the window of the cafe. Ray really hoped that this meeting would help him finally learn more about magic. He glanced again at the note Philip had given him. The information about the target's schedule had come from some informant named Joni. Suddenly, a smiling young waiter appeared in front of his table. He placed a plate of food and a glass with a drink in front of Ray, announcing the order. Ray looked at the waiter's name tag with surprise. It read, Joni. It was the same informant who had given the information to Philip. Ray said he hadn't ordered anything. Joni replied that it was a treat on the house for Hunter, a hero to the local kids, and Ray agreed. Joni enthusiastically invited Ray to ask anything he wanted. He even jokingly offered to tell him the password to their vault. Ray inquired as to the accuracy of that man's schedule from the note. Joni confidently assured him that the information was almost 100% accurate. The waiter explained that he had seen the man during the last 3 months of his employment. The man always entered and left the basement of the building according to the clock. Joni winked slyly, adding an interesting detail with a smile. Thanks to the man's punctuality, he hardly ever had to look at his watch. At that moment, Joni was shouted at by the head cook, noticing that he was slacking off. The waiter apologized and hurried back to his work. Ray glanced at the large wall clock in the cafe. It was about 6 p.m., which meant there was about an hour before his target was supposed to show up. Realizing that he would have to wait, Ray decided to eat the treat. He ate the food while continuing to watch the street through the window. The time dragged slowly. Ray absent-mindedly stroked his fork over the empty plate. He didn't even notice that he'd drawn a funny smiley face on it with the sauce, and then his anticipation was rewarded. A tall man in a hat and coat appeared at the door of the cafe. The very man he had been waiting for. Ray noticed the same red rings of mana around the stranger as the mage. There was no doubt. This man was definitely a powerful mage. He quickly left the cafe, thanking Joni for the treat. The waiter replied cheerfully that it was an honor to serve the hunter. Ray approached the mage's house, knowing the man had been gone for about an hour. He needed to find any trace of magic inside during that time. He pulled the handle of the massive wooden door. As expected, it was locked, blocking his way inside the mysterious dwelling. But Ray wasn't going to back down so easily. With determination in his gaze, he realized he had to find a way in at any cost. Suddenly, he felt a surge of multicolored mana around the door lock. His eyes widened in surprise. The energy was clearly reacting to him. Mana obediently flowed directly into the keyhole, as if responding to his wish. He saw the energy interacting with the lock mechanism. The door opened with a click, and Ray found himself inside the dark room. He looked down at his hand in surprise, not sure how he'd done it. He decided to dismiss thoughts of the strange castle for now. This was not the time to get into the details, but to focus on the main goal. The most important thing was to find any information about this mage. His gaze fell on the trash bags and crumpled papers on the floor in the corner of the room. Ray picked up one of the crumpled sheets, recognizing the mage's handwriting. He wondered to whom he might have written the letter, feeling the prick of memories of the past. He unfolded the letter, reading the lines about a certain red bloodstone. The letter spoke of the possibility of becoming stronger with its help. His gaze caught on the strange phrase at the end of the letter, "Dig to 66. He realized it was some kind of important clue or cipher. The full sentence read, 66 street orphans. Ray remembered Kedrick's words about joining the mercenaries when 66 members were recruited. Ray stared at the letter in astonishment. Was this really the Red Mercenaries enforcer? According to the letter, he had been expelled from the organization. Ray's attention was drawn to a small flat container on the table, which gave off a familiar red glow. He felt a familiar energy. He opened the container and saw a small red stone inside. It was the same stone as the one in Kedrick's ring, the red bloodstone. Ray took the stone in his hand, feeling the same red mana. But unlike normal mana, the stone attracted it much smoother and stronger. His eyes flashed red as he squeezed the stone. Ray wondered what would happen if he tried to use his magic through it. In the same second, a powerful column of bright orange flame burst out from his hand. The incredible power of the stone amplified his own magic many times over. Ray stared in amazement at the bright flame, the strongest he had ever created. It also appeared much faster than usual. Suddenly, he sensed someone's approach and turned around sharply. The magician had returned too soon, not 15 minutes after he'd left the house. A mage stood in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. Blood dripped from the top of his hat, foreshadowing bad news and creating tension in the room. The magician muttered irritably that he couldn't believe it. He'd forgotten his wallet. He complained about his age, figuring his boss had left him because of it. The man seemed to be talking to someone, encouraging a certain Walter. He promised him a return to the organization after the case was over. Ray listened silently. The mage decided to buy more food so he wouldn't have to leave the house for longer. With these thoughts, he headed down the stairs to the basement. Ray watched carefully as the mage left the room again, heading somewhere downstairs. He decided to take a moment to continue his search, but the mage suddenly stopped halfway through, as if he remembered something. He mumbled that he seemed to have forgotten to do something else important before he left. With a sinister grin, he added that he had completely forgotten to put rat poison around the house. His red eyes glittered in the darkness of the stairs. Ray snatched the knife, realizing he had been discovered. The mage shouted angrily from upstairs, which he realized at once. Someone was hiding in his house without asking. Without wasting a second, Ray swiftly attacked the mage. He let out a short sound of surprise and pain, recoiling from the sudden blow. The mage managed to dodge, his hat flying off his head at the sudden movement. He growled a fierce curse at the impudent young stranger. The mage was wounded. Blood was running down his face, preventing him from seeing out of his right eye. He couldn't believe he'd been attacked by a child and not an assassin. Ray jumped back, preparing for the next attack on his opponent. The mage wondered how that child had even managed to open the locked door. Ray decided to act quickly and decisively while he had the chance. He was going to disarm the mage and beat the information out of him by force. The mage hissed an insult, his hand erupting with red energy. He created a sharp dagger out of mana, preparing for a serious fight with Ray. The mage looked at Ray with disdain, assessing his young age. He resented the insolence of a boy who dared to ignore his elder and attack with a knife. Gritting his teeth in pain and anger, the mage couldn't understand one thing. He growled a surprised question as to why the hell this kid was so strong in battle. They froze in front of each other in intense anticipation of battle. The air around them sparked with hostile energy, both preparing for battle. Ray gripped the knife hilt tighter, his gaze cold and focused. He remembered that the man had just mentioned rat poison. The mage focused the mana in the hand holding the magical dagger. He used magic to keep the sharp blade from cutting his own palm. A curved scythe-like blade appeared in the mage's hand. He shouted furiously to Ray, who had only given in before, seeing the child in front of him. The mage rushed to the attack, swinging his weapon at the young man. He viciously promised that he would tear Ray into small, pathetic pieces. Ray looked at the magician's magical blade in front of him with astonishment. A sudden thought flashed through his mind. Could he too be capable of such magic? The mage's face was contorted with shock and unbearable pain, blood still flowing. He stared at Ray in disbelief, unable to believe what was happening. The mage shrieked, not understanding how Ray could use this magic. The young man, however, clearly remembered the combination of colors and mana used by this mage. The mage couldn't believe what was happening, attacking his opponent again. He shouted that metallization was his unique magic that he had invented himself. Ray deftly dodged another lunge from the enraged man. The mage thought with horror. Could this boy really be able to copy other people's magic? The young man counterattacked, his blade flashing through the air in front of the enemy. The blade left another cut on the mage's body, spurting scarlet blood. The mage cried out again in searing pain, his face contorted in a grimace of anguish. He hadn't expected such speed and power from his young opponent. Staggering from the blow, the mage stepped back, dropping his weapon from his hands. He clutched at the new wound, breathing heavily from pain and surprise. The mage's eyes lit up with red demonic light, and he grinned evilly. He decided he'd been right. This kid had definitely been sent by his boss. He remembered the rumors of a unique assassin capable of copying magic. Realizing this, the mage grabbed his wounded arm and screamed in pain and rage. Ray stood over the defeated mage, holding his knife ready to strike. He considered lowering his voice to hide his real identity. He grabbed the mage by the collar of his cloak, pulling him sharply closer to him. Ray had a lot of important questions for him, and he was waiting for answers. Ray ordered him not to show off and to answer the questions immediately. The mage laughed, noting that he hadn't expected to see the famous assassin so young. Ray realized from his experience that it was useless to have a dialogue with such people. He decided that it would be better to knock out the information and get rid of him. The mage laughed madly, determined to show his true strength to his boss. He vowed to burn Ray to the ground, calling him a cursed assassin from the organization. A huge pillar of fire erupted around the mage, filling the room with heat. Ray jumped back in shock at the unexpected and very powerful attack. The flame-haired mage wheezed his last words through the pain. He wanted Ray to deliver some important message to his mysterious boss. The burning mage shouted that Walter the Blood-Eye would be visiting the boss soon, but he added gloatingly that it would only happen if Ray got out alive. He continued to shout through the flames, gloating. He was sure his boss was now deeply regretting having dared to throw him out of the organization. Ray saw the mana spinning rings around the flaming mage. Because of this, red energy was spreading rapidly through his body through his vessels. The young man frowned, realizing the danger of the situation. He thought that if he hadn't protected himself with mana earlier, he would have been in a very bad way. The mage continued his furious monologue, accusing Ray of the assassination attempt. He shouted that the assassin had come to take his life and the red bloodstone. Engulfed in flames, the mage spread his arms defiantly to the sides. He grinned madly, suggesting that Ray try to kill him if he dared. Ray clenched his fists, concentrating his multicolored mana. Streams of energy of different colors swirled around his hands, preparing for a powerful release. The young man thrust his hands forward, releasing a stream of mixed mana. The energy collided with the mage's fire attack, creating a bright flash of light. The mage burst into mocking laughter when he saw Ray's protective barrier. He praised that the assassin had that level of magic since he had come after him. Ray steadfastly held his defenses against the fiery onslaught of the enemy. The mage mockingly asked how long the young man planned to simply defend himself against him. Ray realized that he couldn't get close to the mage because of the fire. Besides, he felt that his own defenses wouldn't last long against such power. The mage chuckled again and stepped up his attack, unleashing an even bigger fire tornado on Ray. He asked how Ray was doing, realizing that Ray wouldn't be able to block it. But Ray changed tactics, deciding to put out those flames first. He crossed his arms in front of him, concentrating a new type of mana for a counterattack. The mage was startled to see that Ray had removed his defenses before his attack. He shouted disbelievingly, wondering if this boy had gone completely insane with fear. Instead of defense, Ray unleashed a powerful stream of blue energy at the mage. The streams of water collided with the fire, hissing and raising puffs of steam around the mage. Ray's eyes flashed a bright blue light, reflecting the water elemental. The mage was shocked to realize that the young man was using two basic types of magic at the same time. The flames around the mage began to weaken under the onslaught of water. He cried out in bewilderment. Did Ray really possess the water element and not be an assassin? The water currents completely engulfed the mage, knocking out the last of the flames. Ray stood across the room, watching the result of his unexpected attack. The young man touched his nose, from where a thin trickle of blood flowed. He realized that it was a side effect of using magic at the limit of his strength. Ray wiped away the blood while pondering the strength of the defeated mage. His firepower was incomparable, and his speed of mixing mana colors was astounding. Ray pondered the strength of the defeated mage Walter. He couldn't imagine how much stronger his main enemy, the mage with the monocle, was then. The image of the mage shrouded in dark mana came before his eyes. Ray realized that he didn't have the strength to avenge him now. However, the young man resolutely clenched his fist, his gaze filled with cold confidence. He was determined that he would eventually become much stronger than them. He looked down, regretting the past. If only he had known earlier that things would turn out this way, maybe he would have acted differently then. Ray glanced at the red stone in his hand that he had taken from Walter. He thought that if he had known of its power, he would have taken all the stones. The next morning, Ray walked to Veronica's bookstore again. The sun illuminated the familiar brick building with the sign above the entrance. Veronica greeted him cheerfully at the entrance, holding a stack of books. She smiled broadly when she saw Ray, who had come as promised. The girl was surprised to note that Ray had changed his clothes. She remembered that yesterday he'd been wearing a dark cloak, like a raincoat for the weather. Ray calmly confirmed that he had gotten rid of those old clothes. His current look, a simple white shirt, was very different from yesterday's appearance. He thought to himself that it was necessary. Although the mage couldn't see his face, he could memorize the clothes, so Ray decided to change them for disguise. Veronica led him up the stairs, telling him the news along the way. She reported that she had told her grandfather about him and his help with magic. Ray tensed a little and asked if she'd said anything too much. Veronica assured him that she hadn't, because he hadn't told her much himself. As they walked down the hallway, two curious children peered out from behind the door. They looked at Veronica's unfamiliar guest with apprehension and interest. Veronica explained with a smile that they were her younger brother and sister. Grandpa had taken them from the orphanage, giving them a new home and a family at the store. Ray speculated aloud, did Grandpa really take them to teach magic? Veronica gasped in shock, wondering how he could have guessed. The young man calmly explained that there were no other obvious reasons. Besides, Veronica herself had mentioned that it was her grandfather who had taught her magic. Veronica confusedly recognized that he was quite right in his guess. She was a little embarrassed by her reaction to his insight. They came to a closed door at the end of the hallway. Veronica said that her grandfather was here in this room, waiting for them to arrive. The girl knocked and called out to Grandpa Graham, informing him that she had brought Ray. She reminded the old man that this young man had helped them last night. A quiet voice came from behind the door, and an old, gray-haired man appeared. He looked at Ray with wise eyes, as if recognizing his soul. Grandpa Graham asked Veronica to wait outside the room for a while. The girl obediently agreed, leaving Ray alone with the old man in his bedroom. The first thing the old man did was to thank Ray sincerely for his help yesterday. His voice was weak, but his eyes showed genuine appreciation for his guest. Graham said he heard Ray help Veronica with the bullies. He complained that he should have done it himself, but his health no longer allowed it. Ray saw the old man's complex aura consisting of 4 rainbow rings. It shimmered with many colors, creating an incredible kaleidoscope of energy. He remembered the meanings of the mana colors. Red was anger, yellow was joy, and green was embarrassment. It was almost impossible to experience all these emotions at once. The young man realized that these were not Graham's current emotions. These colors were marks engraved on his mana vessel over the old mage's many years of life. It was hard for Ray to read the old man's true feelings through the kaleidoscope. Graham noticed what he heard, though Ray wanted to hear a lot of things from him. Ray admitted that he'd been looking for a magician for a long time for answers. Graham grinned, pointing out that, judging by Veronica's words, Ray himself was pretty good at magic. The old man asked the young man's name and where he came from. He noted that Ray didn't seem to be from around here. His appearance was different from the locals. Ray remained silent, not knowing what to say to the old man's direct question. Graham understood his confusion, seeing that the young man had a long and complicated history. Then the old man suggested playing a game, since Ray was having a hard time answering. His eyes flashed white, and he suggested some special rules for the game. The winner of each round of their magical game would be able to ask the loser a question. Graham smiled slyly, anticipating an interesting competition with the young man. Graham praised Ray's quick reaction, noting it as proof of his keen senses. He realized that this was no ordinary young man, but a capable mage. The old man bluntly asked if Ray could sense the special mana between them now. He wanted to test the level of perception of his young mage guest. Ray briefly confirmed that he could feel the energy. He didn't just feel it, he could see it. And unlike other mages he knew, he could interact with it. Graham's aura suddenly changed, becoming more calm and collected. He began to explain to Ray the basics of magic and the interaction of the various elements. Ray sensed the element of maintaining between them, necessary for the homeostasis of magic. He realized that this element operated without outside factors or influences. Graham added that this element was the most difficult to maneuver and control. He then asked Ray probingly about the element behind himself. The old man was shocked when Ray answered. He asked incredulously, could the young man really feel 2 elements of support at once rather than one single one? Ray calmly confirmed that he could see 2, a light gray and a dark gray color. Though they looked more like different tones of the same gray shade of mana. Old man Graham laughed incredulously, covering his face with his hand in surprise. He was amazed at what he had heard from the young man sitting across his bed. He thought to himself that he didn't have to go through hundreds of shelters. Ray instantly saw the elements of maintenance and duration that a normal mage couldn't. Graham sighed sadly, lamenting the cruelty of fate. He didn't have long to live, and he'd just now met a real, true magical talent. Ray, taking advantage of the pause, asked his question to the old man again. He wanted to know the name of that second element he'd seen behind maintain. The old man smiled slyly, deciding not to reveal all the cards at once. He suggested that Ray win the game and find out the answer to his question. Graham explained the simple rules of their magical game. A sphere created from two different elements of their own mana floated between them. The purpose of the game was simple. They had to pull the sphere with their mind. The first person to pull it to his or her hand, as they had done with Veronica, would win. The old man suggested that for the sake of fairness, the sphere should be placed closer to Ray first. He wanted to give the young man a slight advantage in their contest. Ray realized that it wouldn't be easy to defeat such an experienced mage. But Graham had given him a break, so there was still a chance of victory. The old man extended his hand forward, giving the command to start the first round. He commanded, "Go!" And the magical game began between them. Ray concentrated and extended his hand toward the hovering sphere as well. He accepted the old man's challenge, ready to fight for the right to ask his question. However, the sphere swiftly rushed towards Graham's hand, disobeying Ray. The old man easily caught it with his palm, ending the first round very quickly. Ray stared in amazement at the orb in the old man's hand. He hadn't expected such speed and power of control from a sick and weakened-looking mage. Graham smiled contentedly, clutching the captured orb more tightly in his hand. He praised Ray for his quick reaction, even though he'd lost the round. The old man announced that it was his turn to ask the first question. He looked at the young man carefully, preparing to learn something important about him. Graham asked who Ray had learned magic from, who was his teacher. He answered calmly and directly that he was self-taught, that he had learned everything on his own. The old man was surprised again, his eyes round with surprise. He muttered that this was the second time Ray had surprised him that day. Ray asked if a self-taught mage was rare in their world. Graham promised to answer that question, but only if Ray could win the game. The young man nodded, accepting the condition and preparing for another round. He reached forward again, announcing the start of the next game with the old man.